She found the letters in a rusted tin box buried beneath her dead husband's floorboards. 6 of them, still sealed, still addressed in a handwriting she had spent 12 years trying to forget. Her hands were shaking before she finished reading the first one. Evelyn, I'm coming back for you. Please wait. Dated June 1877. She had been waiting. She had waited so long that she married another man just to stop hurting. Someone had stolen those letters. Someone who sat at her table, called her family, and watched her grieve, and said nothing. And the man she had buried her love for? He was standing right now in her doorway, rain-soaked and hollow-eyed, holding a sleeping 2-year-old boy against his chest like the child was the only thing keeping him upright. 12 years, 6 stolen letters, 1 destroyed life. If that were you, would you let him in? If this story is already pulling at something in your chest, hit that subscribe button and stay with me. Because what happens next will shake you. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The knock came at the worst possible moment, the way most things did in Evelyn Mercer's life. She was on her knees in the kitchen, her dress soaked through with the dirty water pooling across the floor from the pipe that had finally given up under the sink. 3 months of drought outside, and somehow there was still water finding a way to ruin her evening. A tin pot sat underneath the leak, already full, already overflowing, and Evelyn had exactly 32 cents to her name and a mortgage payment due in 11 days. She was calculating whether she could sell the 2 remaining horses, one of whom was limping, or whether she should let the cattle go first, and none of her numbers were adding up, and the lamp above her was flickering because the oil was low, and then someone knocked on her front door. She didn't move for a second. She genuinely considered not answering. People who knocked on her door after dark in Mill Haven, Montana, in October of 1889 were rarely bringing good news. It was either the bank's courier riding early with another notice, or one of the Greer boys drunk and confused about which property line was whose. Either way, Evelyn was wet, tired, and not in a condition to be gracious about it. She grabbed a rag off the counter, wiped her hands, and went to the door. She opened it. And the world she had spent 12 years carefully, deliberately, painstakingly rebuilding cracked straight down the middle. He looked older. That was her first thought, which was stupid, because of course he did. 12 years was 12 years, and she was not the same person either. But the way he had aged was not the way she had imagined in the brief, weak moments when she had allowed herself to imagine it at all. Jonah Calloway had gone gray at his temples. There was a scar she didn't recognize along his left jaw. His coat was soaked through. His boots were held together by what appeared to be pure stubbornness, and he was holding a small child pressed against his shoulder. A little boy, maybe 2 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too big, fast asleep with his mouth slightly open and one small fist curled against Jonah's collarbone. Jonah looked at her. His eyes were the same. Brown and deep-set and careful, the kind of eyes that always looked like they were deciding something important. Right now they looked like a man who had walked to the edge of every option he had and found nothing but air. Evelyn, he said. Just her name, like that was enough. Like he hadn't vanished without a word in the spring of 1877 and left her waiting through an entire summer, then a fall, then a winter, writing letters. He never answered, asking around town until the asking itself became humiliating. Like he hadn't simply disappeared and let her assume, month by month, that she had been wrong about everything. She stood in the doorway and did not say a word. He had the decency to look down. I know, he said. I know I don't have any right to be standing here. Then why are you? He adjusted the child on his shoulder. The boy stirred, made a small, unhappy sound, and then went still again. Because there's nowhere else. Evelyn looked at the child for a long moment. She looked back at Jonah. Whose boy? Mine. A pause. His mother, Clara. She passed 4 months ago. Fever. She absorbed that. It did not soften her. It simply added weight to an already heavy moment. I'm sorry about your wife. We weren't married. She let that sit without comment. I've been in Mill Haven 3 days, Jonah said. I went to Mrs. Pulaski's boarding house first. She turned us away. Tried the Hartwell Inn. They told me the same thing. I've got money, Evelyn. It's not that I can't pay. They just... He stopped, pressed his lips together. The boy's been sick. Not dangerous sick, just... He had a cough last week, and word got around, and now every door in town is closed to us. I tried sleeping in the livery stable last night, and they locked us out at midnight. Evelyn thought about the bank notice on her kitchen table. She thought about the horses, the limping one, the mortgage, the pipe leaking into the tin pot that was probably overflowing again right now. "You could have written," she said. Something flickered in his face. "I did." She laughed. It was a short, unpleasant sound. "No, you didn't." He opened his mouth, closed it. Whatever he had been about to say, he thought better of it. "I'm not here to argue with you about the past. I'm here because my son needs somewhere to sleep that isn't a doorway, and because you are the only person I know in this county who might have enough decency to hear me out before you say no." "That's quite a speech. I've been practicing it since sundown." The child shifted again. He murmured something half-formed in his sleep, and his small hand grabbed at the collar of Jonah's coat. Like even unconscious, he knew not to let go of the one solid thing available. Evelyn stepped back from the door. She did not say, "Come in." She just moved, and that was enough. She made coffee because it was something to do with her hands. Jonah sat at her kitchen table with the boy, Micah, he told her, draped across his lap, still asleep, shoes still on, because Jonah didn't want to risk waking him. The kitchen still smelled like wet floor and lamp oil. The tin pot was, as predicted, overflowing. Evelyn put another pot under it without comment. Jonah watched her move around the kitchen the way a man watches something he's lost, and then found somewhere unexpected. She felt it and did not look at him. "You own this place now," he said. It wasn't really a question. "My husband left it to me." She put the coffee on the stove. "He died 2 years ago. Thomas Mercer." "I heard, I'm sorry." "Were you in Montana then?" "Wyoming, then Oregon for a while, came back through." He looked down at Micah. "After Clara died, I wasn't sure where I was going, just knew I couldn't stay where we were. Too many people who knew her, and none of them thought much of me for how things were between us. It was complicated. Things usually are when they're not done honestly." He didn't flinch exactly, but his jaw tightened. "I deserve that." "You deserve more than that." She said it evenly, not cruelly, just a fact. "But it's late, and there's a child asleep in my kitchen, so we'll leave it at that for tonight." She poured the coffee and set a cup in front of him. He wrapped both hands around it like it was the first warm thing he'd touched all day, which, knowing the temperature outside, might have been accurate. "I can work," he said. "Whatever you need, fences, animals, the well, the roof. I can see from the road things have gotten hard. I'm not asking for charity." "Good. I don't have any to give. I'm asking to earn it. Me and Micah out of the weather, and I'll work the ranch. Honest work, honest arrangement. Nothing—" He stopped himself. "Nothing more than that unless you say different." Evelyn sat down across from him. She looked at the child. He had dark hair, the same serious brow as his father, and a small cut on his chin that was healing crooked because nobody had thought to pull the edges together when it was fresh. She looked at Jonah. "You'll sleep in the barn," she said. "That's fine. There are blankets in the chest by the far wall. Take what Micah needs first. There's a wood stove out there, but the flue needs cleaning. Don't light it until morning when I can watch you do it." "Understood." "In the morning, I'll show you what needs doing. There's about 10 years of work on this property, and only 2 of those are your fault." She paused. "Maybe 3. He almost smiled. It was a tired, wrecked kind of almost smile, the kind that meant he knew he didn't have the right to a real one yet. "Thank you, Evelyn." "Don't thank me. I need a working ranch more than I need my pride." She stood and began moving toward the door to show him out to the barn. "And Jonah?" "Yeah. Don't make me regret this." He looked at her steadily. "I will try every day not to." Which was, she would think later, the most honest thing he could have said. Not "I won't." Not "I promise." Just "I will try every day." Like he already knew that trying was all either of them had left. She lay awake until 2 in the morning, not thinking about Jonah, she told herself. Thinking about the ranch. The south fence was down in 3 places. The windmill had been making a grinding noise since August that she hadn't been able to diagnose. The well depth had dropped 8 feet since July, and the water still coming up tasted faintly of iron, which might mean nothing and might mean the well was dying. 2 of her hired hands had quit in September when she couldn't meet payroll, and she'd been managing alone since then with a 17-year-old neighbor boy who came by twice a week when he wasn't needed at his own family's place. She had not told anyone how bad it was. Not the banker, Mr. Crane, who already looked at her like a problem he was waiting to solve. Not her neighbor Harriet Voss, who was kind but talked. Not her sister in Billings, who would worry and offer money she couldn't spare. She had been managing alone because that was what she did. She had been doing it since Thomas got sick, and before that, frankly, since long before Thomas. Managing alone was the thing she was best at, but the numbers weren't working. She knew that. She had known it since September. She stared at the ceiling and thought about a 2-year-old boy sleeping in her barn with a healing cut on his chin and shoes still on his feet, and she thought about 6 letters she had never received, and she thought about how profoundly unfair it was that Jonah Calloway's eyes were still exactly the same. Then she thought, he said he wrote letters. She turned that over for a while. He had said it plainly, without drama. I did. Like it was simply a fact he expected her to reject. And she had rejected it. Of course she had. Nobody had written to her. She had waited and watched and asked at the post office enough times that old Mr. Delaney had started averting his eyes when she came in, and there had been nothing, not a single word. Jonah wasn't a liar. He was a lot of things she could criticize, but she had known him from the age of 19, and lying wasn't in his nature, which meant either something had gone wrong or 12 years had changed him into someone she no longer knew at all. She fell asleep before she could decide which was worse. Micah woke at dawn and walked directly into her kitchen. Evelyn was at the stove when she heard the barn door and then small feet on her porch steps, and she turned to find a 2-year-old in the doorway, in socked feet. He'd lost the shoes somewhere, looking at her with the focused intensity of a child assessing a situation he didn't fully understand. His dark hair was sticking up on one side. He had a blanket still clutched in one fist, and something that might have once been a stuffed rabbit in the other. "Your father know you're out here?" Evelyn asked. Micah stared at her. He said something. It was not entirely a word. "He's still asleep?" More sounds. Possibly yes. "You're hungry." This produced the clearest response she'd gotten, a solemn, immediate nod. Evelyn looked at this child for a moment. He looked back at her without any fear at all, which was either very good parenting or very limited experience of the world, and she suspected it was some of both. His coat from last night was gone. He was wearing a shirt that had been washed so many times the original color was guessable rather than visible. The cut on his chin was definitely going to scar crooked. "Well," she said, and turned back to the stove. "Sit down then." He climbed into the chair that had been Thomas's, the one nearest the window, with a great deal of effort and zero assistance requested. He arranged the blanket and the rabbit on the table in front of him with what appeared to be a very specific system. Then he looked at her expectantly. "Eggs?" she said. "Nod." "You going to make that face at everything I say?" Apparently yes, because he made it again. Evelyn cracked 2 eggs into the pan and felt something in the rigid, carefully maintained architecture of her chest shift approximately 1 inch to the left. Jonah appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later, halfway alarmed and halfway embarrassed, his hair doing something similar to Micah's. He stopped when he saw the boy sitting at the table with an empty egg plate and a look of deep satisfaction. Jonah rubbed the back of his neck. "He does that. Just walks places. I woke up, and he was gone, I thought." "He's fine," Evelyn said. She was washing the pan. "Ate 2 eggs. Didn't say much. He doesn't talk much yet." A pause. She was working with him on it, and since she passed, he kind of... Another pause. "He communicates, just not always in words." "He communicates fine." She dried the pan and hung it back on the hook. "Coffee's still warm." Jonah crossed the kitchen and poured himself a cup. He stood and drank it near the stove, not sitting, like he was still calibrating how much space he was allowed to take up. Micah watched his father with the same focused assessment he'd turned on Evelyn earlier. There was something in that look, something knowing and older than 2 years, that caught in Evelyn's chest. This boy had already lost too much. She could see it in him, the way he held the rabbit, the way he had climbed into an unfamiliar chair without asking for help, because help was not something he'd learned to count on being available. "I'll show you the fence line after breakfast," she said, looking away. "The south side first. That's where the cattle keep getting through. I'll take care of it." "I know you will. That's why I told you about it." She kept her voice level. "There's tools in the shed. Take what you need. If something's missing that should be there, it probably got sold in August. I'll tell you what I sold and you can tell me if there's a workaround." Jonah set down his cup. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated, something that had the quality of a man recognizing exactly how much he'd forfeited and trying to calculate whether there was any path back. "Evelyn," he said, "don't." She picked up her coat from the hook. "Let's just see how the week goes." She went outside. The morning air was sharp and cold, and the sky to the west had the kind of flat, milky look that meant no rain today, and probably not tomorrow either. She stood on her porch and looked at her land, the dead grass, the leaning fence posts, the windmill catching nothing because there was no wind yet, and she breathed through her nose and reminded herself that she had survived worse. Then she went to work. And from the barn, she could already hear Jonah starting, the sound of a man who intended to stay. The first week passed in the way hard work always passes, faster than you expect and slower than you want, measured not in hours but in tasks completed and tasks remaining, with the ratio never quite moving in your favor. Jonah fixed the south fence in 2 days. Not patched it, not propped it up with wire, and hoped the way the previous repair had been done. Actually fixed it, pulling the rotted posts and setting new ones from timber he found stacked behind the shed, tamping them down so solid that Evelyn walked the line on the third morning and pressed her boot against each one and couldn't move a single post even slightly. She didn't say anything about it directly. She just nodded when she got back to the yard, and Jonah, who had been watching from the barn doorway, understood. That was how they communicated in those first days. Efficiently, practically. With the kind of focused neutrality that both of them understood was the only version of civil that was currently available. Micah was the only one who didn't bother with any of it. By the third day, he had located every interesting corner of Evelyn's property and cataloged them with the systematic thoroughness of a very small surveyor. He knew where the chickens were kept and had formed strong opinions about which hen was the most cooperative. He had found the space under the porch where the ranch's old dog, a gray-muzzled shepherd named Packet, spent most of his days, and he had appointed himself Packet's primary companion in a way that Packet seemed to accept with weary dignity. He had also discovered that if you stood on the lower rail of the paddock fence and held out your hand flat, Evelyn's younger horse, the one that wasn't limping, a dark bay mare named Frances, would eventually come over and blow warm air on your palm. Evelyn watched him figure this out on Wednesday afternoon and felt the shift in her chest again, the same one from the first morning with the eggs. It was a dangerous feeling, and she was aware of that. She was not this child's mother. She was not this child's anything. She was a woman who had made a practical arrangement with a man she had extensive unresolved history with, and Micah was part of that arrangement, and that was the extent of it. She told herself this clearly and firmly, and then went inside to start supper, because she had learned over the years that the best response to feelings she didn't want was usually motion. Jonah came in that evening with mud to his knees, and something caught in his expression that he was working to keep neutral. He washed at the pump in the yard, ate the supper she put in front of him, and then sat back in his chair and said, "The well." "I know. It's bad, Evelyn. The water level's down. I measured it this afternoon. You've lost close to 10 feet since the last mark on the rope, and the mark looks maybe 2 years old. Thomas made that mark, right before he got sick." Jonah processed that. "The casing's solid, which is something. But if you don't get rain in the next 6 weeks, you're going to be hauling water from the river, and that's going to get hard fast with winter coming." "I know," she said again, and she said it without inflection, and he understood that she had known for a while. He was quiet for a moment. Micah was asleep already. He went down hard after full days outside, boneless and instant, the way young children sleep when they've truly spent themselves. The kitchen was just the two of them, and the sound of the lamp and rain that had not come. "The mortgage payment," Jonah said. "When's it due?" "That's not your business." "I'm not asking to fix it. I'm asking so I know what we're working against." She looked at him. 11 days was 11 days, now it's 8. "How short are you?" "Jonah, Evelyn." He leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, just present. "I have money. I have some put away. It's not—" He seemed to choose his words with care. "It's not what it should be for a man my age with a son to raise, but it's something. I want to put it toward the payment." "No." "Why not?" "Because then I owe you. You don't owe me anything. You gave my son a roof. You gave me—" "An arrangement," she said. "We made an arrangement. You work, you and Micah have a place to stay. That's the arrangement. Money doesn't come into it." He sat back. She could see him deciding not to push it, which she respected even as she recognized he wasn't done with the subject. He had a patience to him now that hadn't been there at 24. At 24, Jonah Calloway had been a man who felt things immediately and showed it, quick to laugh, quick to anger, quick to reach for her hand in the dark. Whatever the last 12 years had done to him, they had installed something quieter in the space where that immediacy used to live. She wasn't sure yet if that was better or worse. "There might be another way," he said after a while. "The Hargrove brothers over on the East Ridge. I passed their spread on the way in. Their water situation looks better. If the drought holds, they might be willing to work out a water sharing arrangement in exchange for labor. I've met the Hargrove brothers. And? And Dale Hargrove once told me that a woman running a ranch alone was like a horse trying to shoe itself." She stood and began clearing the plates. "So no, we're not asking the Hargrove brothers for anything." Jonah was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, "I'd like to have a word with Dale Hargrove." "You'll do no such thing." I know. But there was something in his voice, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, that she caught, and that she had to be careful not to respond to, because responding to it would be the beginning of something she hadn't decided yet to allow. She washed the dishes. He dried them without being asked. They stood at the same counter and did not speak, and the silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who used to know each other very well, carefully holding the space between who they were then and who they were now, waiting to see what lived in the gap. "You said you wrote letters," she said, when the last dish was on the shelf. She felt him go still beside her. "6, he said. "I wrote 6. Started writing the second week after I left." "You left in April?" "Yes." "I checked the post every week until October." She hung up the dish rag. "There was nothing, Jonah, not one letter. Mr. Delaney at the post office. He knew me by name before it was over. I know they didn't arrive." His voice was careful, precise, like he was describing something he'd thought about many times and was still not sure of the shape. "I didn't know that then. I wrote, and when you didn't write back, you thought I'd moved on. I thought you were done with me, that you'd decided while I was gone that I wasn't what you wanted." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the counter. His jaw was set in the way it always had been when he was holding something difficult still. "I waited," she said. "I want you to understand that. I am not telling you for sympathy. I am telling you as a fact. I waited a very long time, Jonah." "I know." And then I stopped. She moved toward the doorway, because this conversation needed to be done for tonight. She could feel the edges of it getting sharp. "I stopped waiting, and I married Thomas. And Thomas was a good man. He was not. She stopped, steadied. "He was a good man, and I will not regret him. I'm not asking you to." "I know you're not." She paused in the doorway. "I just need you to know that I didn't choose Thomas to spite you. I chose him because I had a life to build, and I couldn't keep waiting for something that I believed was already gone." Jonah looked up at her then. His eyes in the lamplight were very dark. "I know," he said, for the third time, and each time he said it, there was a different weight underneath it. She went to bed. She lay awake for a long time again. On Saturday, Harriet Voss came by. Harriet was 61, built like a woman who had been arguing with the frontier for 4 decades and winning on points. And she had been Evelyn's nearest neighbor and closest friend since Thomas's funeral. She arrived on her gray mule, Sergeant, around mid-morning, saw the repaired fence line from the road, slowed Sergeant down, looked at it for a long moment, and then continued to the yard with the expression of a woman who had arrived expecting one situation and found another. Jonah was at the windmill when she rode in. He was partway up it, not to the top, but high enough to get a look at whatever was making the grinding noise. And Harriet stopped Sergeant in the yard and looked up at him, and then looked at Evelyn, who had come out from the garden. "That's a man on your windmill," Harriet said. "Yes." "Do you know him?" "I do." Harriet waited with the patience of someone who had learned that Evelyn shared information on her own schedule and not before. "His name is Jonah Calloway," Evelyn said. "He's doing repair work." Harriet's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees, which for Harriet was the equivalent of most people's mouths falling open. "Calloway," she repeated. The one who's fixing my windmill, yes." "And the child?" Because Micah had appeared on the porch at the sound of a visitor, holding Rabbit, watching Sargent with the focused attention he gave to all large animals. His son, his name's Micah. Harriet dismounted Sargent with the ease of a woman who had done it 10,000 times. She tied him to the porch rail, looked at Micah, and said, "Hello, boy." Micah looked at her steadily. "He doesn't talk much," Evelyn said. Harriet looked at Micah a moment longer, then back at Evelyn with an expression that very clearly meant, "We are going to discuss this at length," and equally clearly meant not in front of the child. "I brought butter and that cough remedy you asked about last month. Took me a while to get the recipe right." "Come in, then." Inside, Harriet sat at the kitchen table. Not Thomas's chair, she had her own preferred chair, the one by the window, and watched Evelyn make coffee with the same expression she'd worn looking at the fence line. "How long?" she said. "A week." "He just appeared." "With the boy, yes. He'd been turned away all over town." Harriet made a sound that wasn't quite approving and wasn't quite the opposite. "And you let them stay." "I need the help, Harriet. You know how bad it's gotten." "I know. I also know that man left you without a word and never—" "He says he wrote." Silent. "Letters," Evelyn said. "6 of them, he says. That never arrived." Harriet looked at the table, then at the window, then back at Evelyn with something working behind her eyes. "Your uncle was managing the post for your family that summer." Evelyn looked at her. "While your father was ill," Harriet said slowly. "I remember. Theodore was over at your place quite a bit, handling affairs while your father—" "Theodore." Evelyn said the name flat and clean. "He collected the mail for the household, I remember that, and took things to be posted. Your father couldn't get to town." "Theodore," Evelyn said again. Harriet said nothing. Evelyn stood very still in the middle of her kitchen. Theodore Hale, her mother's younger brother. He had been at every family dinner until he died in 1883 of a bad heart, which frankly not enough people had mourned. He had been attentive and ingratiating and deeply interested in who was going to inherit what in a family he had no real claim to. He had also, now that Evelyn was standing in her kitchen with the information arranging itself coldly into a pattern, been present the summer of 1877 when she had been writing to Jonah and waiting for Jonah and slowly breaking apart over the absence of Jonah. Theodore, who had managed the mail. Theodore, who had told her gently but firmly that young men who left for new opportunities rarely came back, and that she ought to be sensible, and who had introduced her to Thomas Mercer at a church social in September of that same year with a warmth that she had at the time found touching. Theodore, who had stood at her wedding and toasted Thomas and told Evelyn she was making the smartest decision of her life. "I need to go outside for a minute," Evelyn said. She went out the back door and stood in the cold and breathed until the shaking in her hands settled. She didn't tell Jonah that day. She wasn't sure why exactly. Part of it was that she needed to be more certain than one old memory and a neighbor's recollection before she handed him something that large. Part of it was that she was still rearranging the furniture of the last 12 years inside her own head, putting every memory of Theodore back against this new understanding and seeing how it changed the room. And part of it, the part she was least comfortable with, was that knowing who had stolen the letters didn't actually change what those years had been. She had still waited. She had still hurt. She had still eventually stopped waiting and built a life without him. And that life had been real, and Thomas had been real. And she wasn't sure yet what it meant to learn that the original wound had been inflicted deliberately by a man who'd had something to gain from it. Theodore had wanted Thomas Mercer connected to the Hale family. Thomas had been successful, well-regarded, a man of property. Theodore had made the introduction, encouraged the courtship, been present at every step. And he'd needed Jonah Calloway out of the picture first. She was 41 years old. She had been grieving a lie for 12 years. She stood at the paddock fence on Sunday evening and watched Francis move in the last light, and she thought about 12 years of a wound that had never been real, and she thought about whether anger was the right response, or whether she was past anger into something else, something cold and particular that didn't have a comfortable name. Jonah came up beside her. I didn't say anything for a while. He leaned on the fence rail next to her and watched Francis too, and the light went from orange to pink to the flat gray that came right before full dark, and he said, "You've been thinking about something for 2 days." "I think all the time." "I know. This is different." He paused. "I'm not pushing. I can see it, Evelyn. You've got that look." "What look?" The one where you're working out whether to say something that's going to change things. She looked at him sideways. You remember that look? I never forgot it. She turned back to Frances. My Uncle Theodore, she said. He managed the family's mail the summer you left. My father was sick that whole season. You remember? He had the lung trouble. She felt Jonah go still beside her. Theodore collected the post, brought things to be mailed, received things, sorted what came in. She kept her voice even, flat, like she was reading from a ledger. He also introduced me to Thomas in September of that year, took considerable interest in making sure that went well. A long silence. He died in '83, she said. Heart. Jonah said nothing. She could hear him breathing. I don't know for certain, she said. I want to be clear about that. I don't have the letters. I don't have proof. And the man is in the ground and can't answer for any of it. But she stopped. Harriet remembered him handling the post. And it fits, Jonah. It fits everything. The silence stretched out long enough that she finally turned to look at him. His face was very still. Not the stillness of calm. The stillness of a man holding something enormous that he doesn't yet have the structure to contain. His hands on the fence rail had gone white at the knuckles. Jonah's voice was rough. He stopped. He took them. I think so, yes. Another stop. Evelyn, I thought you'd decided. I thought you read what I wrote and you decided you didn't. He pressed his mouth shut, looked away. When he looked back, his eyes were red at the rims and he was not going to cry. She could tell he had decided he was not going to do that, but it cost him. I spent 12 years believing you chose to let me go. And I spent 12 years believing you couldn't be bothered to write. Her voice came out harder than she intended. She didn't correct it. So we both lost the same thing. We just had different reasons given to us for why it was gone. He turned away from the fence and took a few steps, just to have somewhere to put the energy of it. Then he stopped and stood with his back to her, shoulders tight, and she waited. How was at your wedding? Jonah said. He must have heard about it. Montana was not a large world. He gave a toast. Jonah made a sound. It was not a word. I know, she said, and she meant it the same way he had kept meaning it when he said it to her. As acknowledgement, as a kind of weight that had no solution, as something you just had to put down somewhere and figure out how to live near. He turned back around. His face had settled into something grim and deliberate. So all of it, he said. Every year I spent thinking you'd moved on. Every year you spent thinking I'd walked away. All of it because one man wanted to move a chess piece. Yes. And now he's dead, and there's nobody to... He stopped again. He was struggling, and he wasn't hiding it well, and she found unexpectedly that she didn't want him to hide it. It was the most honest she'd seen him since he arrived, and she had needed something honest from him. There's no one to answer for it, she said. No, that's the part I've been sitting with. He looked at her. Are you angry? I have been angry since Saturday afternoon, and I expect I'll be angry for quite some time. She turned away from the fence. But I'm also 41 years old, Jonah, and I don't have the luxury of just being angry. I have a ranch to save and a mortgage due in 6 days and a well that's going dry, and those things don't wait for me to finish being furious at a dead man. She walked toward the house. Evelyn. She stopped but didn't turn. I'm sorry, he said. I know that's not enough. I know nothing I say. It's not about enough, she said. It's about what we do now. That's all I know how to think about right now. What we do now. She went inside. What? The mortgage problem resolved itself in a way she hadn't anticipated, and that made her feel the particular uncomfortable gratitude of someone helped in a way they couldn't refuse. 2 days before the payment was due, Mr. Aldous Fitch rode out from Millhaven. Aldous was not the banker. He was the banker's clerk, and he was also one of Thomas's oldest friends, and he had at various points over the past 2 years done quiet things for Evelyn that he never mentioned and never required acknowledgement for. He arrived with the payment receipt already marked paid in his coat pocket, which meant he had covered it himself, which she had specifically told him 3 months ago not to do. Aldous, she said when he produced it. Don't, he said pleasantly. Thomas would have wanted it. You can pay me back in spring wheat, and I'll call it even. I don't have spring wheat yet. I barely have a functioning well. Then late spring wheat. Evelyn, it is $17. Please let me do this one thing. She looked at the receipt for a long moment. Jonah was at the far end of the yard, diplomatically attending to the fence post nearest the road, not looking at them. Spring wheat, she said. And not a cent different. Not a cent different. He glanced toward Jonah. I heard you had help. Word travels. Always. He settled his hat. For what it's worth, Crane at the bank was asking about you. Not bank business, just asking. He paused, in the way of a man delivering a warning sideways. He's been asking about available properties in this part of the valley for about 3 months now. Evelyn looked at him steadily. He can ask all he likes. I told him as much. Aldous rode out, and Evelyn stood with the paid receipt in her hand and felt the particular exhaustion that came not from crisis but from the constant management of crises, the way you were never fully past one before the next one came into view. She tucked the receipt in her coat pocket and went to tell Jonah about the well. The well was going to require digging deeper, which was either possible or it wasn't, depending on what you hit below the current casing. Jonah said he could dig another 8 feet himself if she could get someone to pull the soil up. She said she could do that. He said it would take most of a week. She said they should start tomorrow. They started tomorrow. It was brutally hard work in a way that Evelyn had not fully anticipated, which surprised her because she had anticipated most things about this ranch being brutally hard. But digging deeper into an existing well, while one person worked below ground, and the other hauled bucket after bucket of heavy clay soil in the October cold was a different category of hard. Her arms ached by noon the first day and were nearly useless by evening. Jonah, who was doing the worst half of the job, came up out of the well at dusk, covered in clay to the collarbone with a cut on his forearm from where the shovel had slipped and with the focused, expressionless look of a man running purely on determination. They didn't talk much those evenings. Micah took care of the talking. He had started stringing 2 words together occasionally. More, said with an authoritative look at the plate. Packet sleep, announcing where the dog had gone. And once, on a Thursday evening, holding up Rabbit toward Evelyn with solemn ceremony, Rabbit hungry. Rabbit can have a bite of biscuit, Evelyn said, very seriously, and broke a piece off and held it toward the stuffed animal. And Micah watched this transaction with the satisfaction of a child whose world was operating correctly. Jonah, across the table, watched Evelyn not watching him. The well hit water on the 6th day. Not a flood of it, not a miracle, just a seep, then a slow, steady rise, clean water with no iron taste, 22 feet down. Jonah came up from the hole at 7 in the morning and told her, and she held out her hand to help him over the casing lip, and when he straightened up, they were standing closer than they had been in 12 years, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted a beat too long. Good, she said, and stepped back. Yeah, he said. They went inside for coffee and did not speak about the moment by the well, which was its own kind of conversation. It was Micah who found the tin box. He had been exploring again. This was simply a fact of life now. Micah explored and reported back, and you dealt with whatever he'd found. And he appeared in the kitchen doorway on a Sunday afternoon in the 2nd week of November with his hands dirty and a small rusted tin held out at arm's length, the way children hold things they understand are important without knowing why. Where'd you find that? Jonah asked from across the room. Micah pointed toward the back of the house. The old cellar access, Evelyn understood. The one under the floorboards in the back bedroom that Thomas had never gotten around to properly sealing. She took the tin from Micah. It was old, older than Thomas, she thought. The rust was thorough. The latch was seized. She worked it with the edge of a knife until it opened. Inside, letters, 6 of them, still sealed, addressed in a handwriting she recognized without wanting to recognize it. Her name on each one, Miss Evelyn Hale. Her family name, from before Thomas. The address, her family's house. The postmarks were from the spring and summer of 1877. She sat down slowly in the nearest chair. Jonah was across the room, and he saw her face before he saw the box, and he was beside her in 3 steps. He looked at the letters in her hands. He didn't say anything. There was nothing that would have been adequate. She counted them. 6. He had said 6. She opened the first one. The paper was dry and the ink had faded to brown, but the words were still there, still his handwriting, still his voice. The careful, thoughtful way he had always put sentences together, like he took punctuation seriously, like he meant each word. He had been in Wyoming by the time he wrote this one. He was working at a cattle operation outside Casper. He was saving money. He was planning to come back in the fall if she would still have him. Please write back, he had said at the end. I know this is a lot to ask. I know I left without enough explanation, and I owe you a better accounting than I gave you. But please, Evelyn, just tell me you got this. She had never gotten it. Theodore had. Theodore had taken it from whatever post it arrived to, or perhaps intercepted it before it was even properly delivered. And he had put it in this tin, and he had put the tin in the cellar of a house he visited often that year. And he had said nothing, not ever. Not to her, not apparently to anyone. She read all 6. She sat at the table and read them one after another in order of their postmarks, Jonah beside her and not speaking, and she felt each one land in a different register. The first one cautious and hoping, the second one a little more uncertain, the third beginning to sound like a man who is starting to understand he might not get an answer, the fourth shorter, the fifth shorter still, and the sixth, the last one, postmarked August of 1877, very brief. I don't know what I did. I don't know if I'll ever know. I hope you're well, Evelyn. I think I'll hope that for a long time. She put the last letter down on the table. She looked at it. Then she pressed both hands flat against the table because she needed the solid surface under her palms, and she looked at the ceiling and she took one careful breath and then another. Evelyn, Jonah said, don't. Her voice came out thin. She steadied it. Don't say anything right now. I need a minute. Micah had been watching all of this from the doorway with that ancient assessing look of his. He walked over, slowly, and climbed into the chair beside her, Thomas's chair, always his preferred chair, and he put Rabbit on the table and then put one small dirty hand on top of Evelyn's. He didn't say anything. He just sat there. Evelyn looked at his hand on hers. She looked at the last letter. She looked at Jonah, who was sitting across from her with 12 years of wrong understanding rearranging itself behind his eyes. He sat at our table, she said. Theodore. He sat at our table and ate our food and watched me grieve, and he never said a word. I know. He stole our whole... She stopped. The word life sat at the edge of the sentence, and she didn't say it, but they both heard it anyway. Jonah reached across the table. He put his hand over her other hand, the one not covered by Micah's. He didn't press. He just put it there. None of them spoke. Outside, the wind had picked up. It was coming from the north, and it carried something in it. Not rain, not yet, but a quality that made the house feel small and the country feel large, the way Montana always did when the season remembered what it was capable of. Evelyn sat between the child who had put his hand on hers without being asked, and the man who had once been everything she expected the future to look like. And she looked at 6 letters that had been lost for 12 years, and she thought, there's no way to give any of this back. Not the years, not the pain, not the choices she had made trying to build a life around an absence that was never real. You couldn't put any of that back the way it was. The years were just gone. But the letters were here now. The truth was here now. And the man across the table, whatever he was to her currently, whatever complicated, unresolved, not yet named thing he was, had not lied. Had not left without caring. Had written 6 times to a woman he loved and gotten silence in return, and had spent 12 years grieving her choice to stay silent. She turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together. It was not a decision, exactly. It was just a movement. His hand closed around hers. Micah went back to examining Rabbit and declared with great authority, Rabbit sleep now. Yeah, Jonah said, very quietly, looking at Evelyn. Okay. And somewhere north of Millhaven, past the ridgeline that divided the valley from the wilderness above it, the wind was picking up ash. Not wood smoke. Not the familiar smell of hearth fires and cooking ranges. Something else. Something drier and more terrible, riding south on a November wind that had decided, without warning, to change everything. Nobody named it right away. That was the thing about wildfire in Montana. By the time people were willing to say the word out loud, the fire had already been making decisions for hours. It moved with the logic of something alive and without mercy, taking the path of most fuel, reading the wind the way a river reads a valley, and it did not wait for human consensus about what to call it. Evelyn smelled it first. She was standing at the kitchen window doing nothing in particular, just looking out at the dark with the tin box of letters still on the table behind her, when she caught it on the air, coming through the gap in the frame she'd been meaning to seal since September. Not wood smoke. She knew wood smoke. She'd grown up with it, cooked with it, heated her house with it for 20 years. This was different, drier, sharper, with a quality underneath it that was hard to name but that her body understood before her mind did. Because she went still the way animals go still when something is wrong in a way they can't yet locate. She opened the back door. The sky to the north was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the orange wall of disaster that people described afterward. Just wrong, in the way a sound can be wrong before you identify what you're hearing. There was a glow along the ridge that didn't belong to the moon and wasn't in the right place for any settlement. It was low and wide, and it pulsed faintly against the underside of the clouds in a way that made her stomach drop before she'd finished understanding what she was seeing. "Jonah," she said. He was behind her in the kitchen, still at the table. He heard her tone and was at the door in seconds. He looked north. A long beat of silence. "How far?" she said. "Past the ridge." His voice had gone flat and focused, the way she'd noticed voices went when men who'd worked outdoors all their lives were calculating something dangerous. "The wind's been coming south all evening." "I know." "If it crests the ridge, how fast?" He looked at the glow, looked at the trees along the tree line, what he could see of them in the dark, reading the movement of the branches. "Fast," he said. "If it's running the way I think it is. The valley's all dry grass and we haven't had rain since. Evelyn, we need to be ready to move." She was already back inside. She went straight to the bedroom first. Not for herself, for the strongbox under the bed. Thomas's deed to the property, the mortgage papers, the money she had left, and the 6 letters in their tin box, which she picked up without stopping to think about why that felt necessary. She wrapped them in a piece of oilcloth and pushed everything into the leather saddlebag she kept on the hook behind the door. When she came back out, Jonah had Micah. The boy was half awake, confused and warm, his face carrying the creased blankness of a child pulled from deep sleep. He was holding Rabbit with both arms, and he looked at Evelyn with eyes that were trying to read the room and finding it difficult. "It's all right," she told him, though she wasn't certain that was true. "We're just going to take a ride." "Dark," Micah said. "Yes, it's dark. Jonah's going to carry you." "Rabbit." "Rabbit comes too." He thought about this seriously, then appeared to accept it. He resettled himself against Jonah's shoulder and went back to the semi-conscious state of a child who has decided to trust the adults in the room. Evelyn got the horses. Frances came out of her stall with her ears already back, already reading the air the way horses read it, that prey animal alertness that Evelyn had always found both useful and unnerving. The older gelding, Amos, was worse. His eyes were showing white, and he was sidling before she even got the halter on him. She spoke low and steady to both of them, the way she always had, and got them out into the yard where Jonah was waiting with Micah, now wrapped in a blanket and looking slightly more awake. The glow to the north had changed in the 10 minutes she'd been inside. It was bigger. Not the kind of bigger that meant it was growing slowly. The kind of bigger that meant it had already been large for a while, and she was only now seeing the full scale of it. "We can't take everything," she said. "I know. The cattle—" She stopped herself. The cattle were already gone, effectively. 6 weeks ago, she'd moved the last of them to the south pasture as a dryland measure, which now meant they were as far from the northern fire line as they could be. Whether they survived depended on whether the fire stayed north, and that was not a calculation she could effect right now. "We go to the river." "Yes." "The Voss place is between us and the river." "I know. We stopped for Harriet." He said it like it wasn't a question, like it was simply part of the plan, and she felt something in her chest respond to that. The ease of it, the assumption that of course they stopped for Harriet, that this was not even a point requiring discussion. She had been making decisions alone for 2 years, and the absence of that aloneness was something she noticed even now, even in the middle of this. They rode out. The night was not quiet. It had the quality of a night that has been disturbed at a fundamental level. The insects were gone, which was wrong for November, but wronger than that. Gone in the way that meant something had driven them out ahead of itself. The horses felt it. Frances kept trying to push her pace past what the dark warranted, and Evelyn kept her in, steady and firm, but she could feel the animals want to simply run, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever was north. The Voss property was 3/4 of a mile east along the main road. The light was showing in Harriet's windows when they arrived, which meant Harriet had already seen it. Harriet was in fact standing on her porch with a rifle and a canvas pack when they rode in, Sergeant already saddled at the rail. She looked at them, looked north, looked back at them with an expression of someone who had been calculating the same variables. "I was going to ride for you," she said. "We rode for you first," Evelyn said. Harriet took the compliment as it was intended, not sentiment, just priority, and stepped off the porch. "Crane's farmhand came by an hour ago. Said the Pemberton family is already at the river crossing. He saw the fire crest the upper ridge while he was riding. It crested the ridge, Jonah said. Western edge, moving southeast. Harriet untied Sargent. The Whitfield family is back toward the Greer land. They've got 4 small children. We'll pass by, Jonah said. They moved. The next hour was this kind of hour that compresses in memory afterward into something much shorter than it was. A series of stops, raised voices, the sound of children crying and animals protesting and wheels on hard ground. The Whitfields had a wagon and 4 children and a grandmother who couldn't ride, and getting them organized and moving took 20 minutes that felt like an hour, during which the glow to the north had become visible not as a glow, but as a line, a low, distinct, terrible line of orange that was moving. Jonah rode ahead of the group twice to check the road, both times coming back with updates delivered in the flat, efficient voice of a man keeping his fear strictly in service of function. The southern road was clear, the river crossing at the Bentley Ford was accessible. The wind was holding southeast for now, which bought them time. The third time he rode ahead, he didn't come back right away. Evelyn kept the wagon moving, kept Harriet beside her, kept one eye on Micah, who was riding in front of her now on Francis, awake and watchful, his silence for once not the comfortable kind. He was looking north with the animal seriousness of a child who understood that something large and wrong was happening without yet knowing the word for it. "Jonah's coming back," she told him. He didn't respond. He watched the tree line. Jonah came back at a canter, which was fast enough to tighten her chest. "Crane's grain barn is already burning," he said. "It's north of the ford but close. We need to move the wagon faster." "The grandmother can't handle a fast wagon." "I know. I'll drive it." He was already off Francis. "Take Micah. Keep the horses moving ahead. I'll manage the wagon. Jonah, Evelyn." His eyes met hers, direct and unequivocal. "Please, take Micah and go." She transferred Micah to Harriet, took Francis's reins back, and rode. She didn't like it. Leaving Jonah behind with the slower rig went against something basic in her. But she understood the logic, and she was not going to waste time arguing with correct logic in a fire emergency. Micah, riding with Harriet, kept his eyes on his father as long as he could see him. The river ford was 3 miles from the Mercer property. They covered it in the dark with the smell of smoke thickening steadily, and the horses becoming progressively more difficult to manage. At the ford itself, 7 families were already gathered. The Pembertons, as reported, the Greer family, the 2 boys Evelyn had privately categorized as chronic nuisances, the Delacroix couple who kept bees and whose wife was very pregnant, and 3 other families she knew less well from the farther reaches of the valley. The crossing itself was low with drought, which was its own terrible irony, shallow enough to ford easily, because there was barely any water left. They put the wagon across first, then the horses, then Sargent, who objected strenuously to the water and the smoke smell, and was eventually persuaded by Harriet with a firmness that brooked no further discussion. On the south bank, with the river between them and the fire, Evelyn looked back north. The ridge was burning fully. The line she had seen as a low orange glow from her property was now a wall. Not a wall you could describe simply, not a clean thing, but a moving, churning mass of orange and black that ate the tree line and threw sparks up into the smoke column above it, the way a storm throws spray. It was the largest fire she had ever seen, and she had lived in Montana her entire life. Jonah pulled the wagon over the ford and up the south bank and stopped the horses and set the brake and climbed down. He stood beside the wagon and looked north for a moment. Then he looked at Evelyn, across the gathered crowd of people and animals. She was already looking at him. He nodded once. She understood it to mean, "We're on the right side of the water." She nodded back. The fire burned through the night. There was nothing to do but wait and watch and manage the things that could be managed, keeping the children from the water's edge, keeping the horses calm, keeping the Delacroix wife comfortable because she was 8 months along and the stress was visible in her face. Harriet took charge of organizing food from what people had brought, which was haphazard and insufficient, and was eventually supplemented when old Martin Pemberton turned out to have an entire smoked ham in his wagon that he'd been saving for Thanksgiving, which was very much not Thanksgiving, but which nobody was inclined to argue about. Micah fell asleep against Evelyn's shoulder sometime around midnight. She was sitting on a log the Greer boys had dragged up from the bank, and Micah had simply subsided against her with the boneless certainty of a child who has decided that this particular person is where sleep happens, and she had put her arm around him without thinking about it, and now he was fully asleep and she was not going to move. Jonah came and sat beside her after a while. Not close enough to be presumptuous, just close enough to be present. The cabin might survive, he said, keeping his voice low so as not to wake Micah. The fire looks like it's running the ridge and the eastern edge. Your property is more central. The wind's been consistent. He stopped. I don't want to tell you something that isn't true. Then don't. Right. He looked at the fire. I don't know if the cabin will survive. She looked at the wall of orange across the water. Thomas built that cabin, she said. He and his father. Before we were married. It's been standing 30 years. I know. My red dress is in the trunk in the bedroom. She said it almost to herself. It was my mother's. She wore it at her wedding. I wore it at mine. She shook her head slightly. Silly thing to think about. It's not silly. There are more important things in that house. The deed's in your saddlebag, he said. The papers, the letters. He paused. I went back in before we left. She turned to look at him. I knew you'd taken the box, but there were things. He was quiet for a moment. The photograph on the mantel. Thomas and you, from your first year. I took it. It's in the saddlebag. And the quilt from the chest, the blue one. I don't know why He stopped again, clearly uncertain whether this was overstepping. I just grabbed things. I'm sorry if I... Don't apologize for that. Her voice came out lower than she intended. Don't. He nodded. They were quiet. Around them, the camp was settling into a grim nighttime rhythm, children sleeping wherever they could be put down, adults sitting in clusters talking in the low voices of people waiting for information, a few of the men at the bank watching the fire with the focused, helpless attention of people for whom watching was the only available action. I need to tell you something, Jonah said. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire. When I left in 77, he said, I've never told you the full reason. Not because I was hiding it, just every time I've tried to explain it in my head, it sounds like an excuse and I'm aware that it would come out that way. Tell me anyway. He was quiet for a moment. My father, he said. You remember how things were with him? She did. Jonah's father had been a man of considerable needs and very little accountability, which had placed the weight of both on his son from an early age. He had debts, Jonah said. Bad ones. To people who weren't the patient type. He came to me in March of that year. You know I'd been saving. I was planning to... He stopped. I was planning to ask you to marry me in May. I had enough set by for a start. Not much, but enough. She had not known this. She went very still. He owed $300 to a man named Purcell out of Billings. Purcell was the kind of man who made his point with other people's faces. Jonah's jaw tightened. He came to me, said if I didn't cover the debt, he'd go to my father, and my father was 62 with a bad heart. He paused. I gave him everything I had. Every cent of 3 years of saving. It wasn't enough. So Purcell offered another arrangement. Work it off. 3 months up north on his operation in Wyoming, room and board, and the debt cleared. 3 months, Evelyn said. I thought it was 3 months. His voice was flat with an old anger at himself. I was 24, and I thought I understood the arrangement. I left in April thinking I'd be back in August at the latest. I didn't want to tell you the full reason because I was ashamed of it. My father's debt, my money gone, showing up to ask you to marry me with nothing. He looked down. I wrote the first letter from Wyoming. Told you I'd be back in the fall. I didn't explain enough. I thought I'd explain when I got back. And Purcell kept you longer. 7 months. Then there were complications. His operation wasn't strictly legal in every particular. I couldn't just walk away. By the time I was clear of it, it was spring of 78, and I'd written 6 letters to silence, and I thought... He pressed his lips together. I thought you'd found out the truth about why I left. That I was covering my father's disgraces. That I'd decided you were better off without me in your life. Evelyn thought about Theodore. About the tin box. About a man who had seen an opportunity in another man's shame and had simply reached out and taken it. You couldn't have known, she said. I should have told you everything before I left. I should have trusted you with the real reason. Yes, she said. You should have. She said it without bitterness, just the plain fact of it. But you were 24 and ashamed, and you made the choice a lot of people make when they're ashamed, which is to protect the thing they're ashamed of and manage the consequences later. She shifted Micah slightly on her shoulder, and then later got managed for you. Jonah looked at her. By Theodore, she said. Who knew about your father's trouble, I'd bet. He made it his business to know things. I didn't know your uncle. You're lucky. He was thorough. She looked at the fire across the water. So you were 24 and scared and managing your father's mess, and I was 20 and waiting, and Theodore was reading your letters and keeping them in a tin box under my future husband's floorboards. She shook her head slowly. We were very thoroughly managed, the two of us. I'm sorry, Evelyn, for all of it. I know you are. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not saying the anger's gone. I'm saying I understand now what I was angry at, and it turns out most of it isn't you. She looked at him sideways. Some of it is still you. That's fair. The part where you didn't tell me everything before you left, that part is still yours. I know. Don't do that again. He looked at her. Tell you everything? Don't keep things to protect me. I've been protecting myself for 41 years, and I'm quite good at it. What I am bad at is being kept in the dark by people who think they're doing me a favor. She held his gaze. If something is wrong, or hard, or shameful, you tell me. That's the only way any of this works. He looked at her for a long moment. The firelight was orange across his face, and it made him look both older and somehow like himself at 24, some quality of light collapsing the 12 years between those two versions of him. Any of this, he repeated carefully. She looked away first. Don't read too much into the phrasing. I'm not reading anything into it. But his voice had changed, just slightly. Something in it that had been braced had loosened, the way a knot loosens after long pressure. Not undone yet, but different. Micah stirred, made a sound, resettled against her. His small hand found the fabric of her coat and gripped it. Jonah watched his son hold on to her, and he looked like a man who was understanding something he hadn't put into language yet. Dawn came slowly behind a sky that was brown with smoke. What it revealed was not what any of them had hoped, and not quite as bad as some of them had feared, which was its own particular frontier mercy. The specific grace of a disaster that does not reach its absolute worst. The valley had burned from the northern ridge down through the timber, through the Crane grain operation, which was a complete loss, through the Whitfield family's eastern pasture, and into the upper valley farmlands where 3 properties had burned entirely to the ground. The Mercer property sat in the middle valley. As Jonah had hoped, not predicted, just hoped, the central wind had pushed the fire's main body east, and the terrain had done what terrain sometimes does, slowed it, broke it, let it exhaust itself against the river draw before it reached the heart of the valley. The cabin was standing. She didn't know this for an hour after dawn. She knew it when Jonah rode across the ford on Amos, who was unhappy about all of it but functional, to get a look at the road north. He was back in 40 minutes, and he came to her directly, not stopping, dismounting while still moving with the efficiency of someone carrying information that needed to arrive. The cabin's standing, he said. The barn's damaged, the east wall and part of the roof. The south fence is gone. The windmill's fine. He paused, because he was clearly aware of how much weight was on the next part. The north pasture burned. Everything north of the fence line. Your winter graze. She absorbed this. The winter graze. Without it, feeding the cattle through to spring became a serious mathematical problem. How bad is the barn? Repairable. Not today, but repairable. The cattle? South pasture's intact. I saw them from the ridge. They came through. She let out a long breath. The cattle were alive. The cattle were the operation's survival. Without them, no spring, no income, no recovery. With them, there was a path forward, narrow and hard and requiring more than she currently had, but a path. The Whitfields lost everything, she said. She had spoken with Hannah Whitfield at first light, a woman not prone to tears who had cried anyway, quietly, turned away from her children, while her husband stood beside her with the look of a man calculating the unthinkable. I know. And the crane operation. Yes. Around them, the camp was waking to its own inventory of loss. The sound of it was specific, not wailing, not drama, but the quieter and somehow worse sound of people doing practical accounting of what was gone, voices low and focused, the occasional silence that meant a number had come in too high to immediately respond to. Jonah was watching her. We should go back, she said, when you're ready. I'm ready now. She looked around the camp. But we can't leave without... She stopped and looked at the Whitfield family, the 4 children, the grandmother sitting on the wagon's tailgate with her hands folded. They have nowhere to go. I know. The Delacroix couple, but May can't ride far in her condition. I know that too. She looked at him. Our barn's damaged, but the cabin's standing. It is. The cabin has 4 rooms. Evelyn. I'm not asking you, she said. I'm thinking out loud. I know the difference. He almost smiled, and it was a different almost smile than the one from the first night. Less wrecked, less provisional, more like something that was starting to believe it might actually get to be a real smile eventually. The cabin's yours. The call is yours. She went to find Hannah Whitfield. She did not frame it as charity. She was deliberate about that, not because charity was wrong, but because she understood how dignity worked in circumstances like these. And Hannah Whitfield was not a woman who would accept help that came with a quality of pity attached. She framed it as practical arrangement, which it also genuinely was. The Whitfield family needed shelter, and she had it, and they had 4 able-bodied adults who could work, and working together through the winter made more sense than struggling separately. Hannah looked at her for a long moment. We'd pay our way, Hannah said. I know you would. I'm counting on it. Hannah's jaw tightened, then released. She nodded once, sharp. All right. She made the same arrangement with the Delacroix couple, less because she expected labor from a woman 8 months pregnant, and more because the nearest physician was 30 miles away, and she didn't want May Delacroix giving birth in a field. That conversation was shorter. Henri Delacroix shook her hand with both of his and said something in French that she didn't understand, but that clearly meant gratitude of the thorough variety. When she came back to where Jonah was waiting with the horses and Micah, he looked at the collection of people now making preparation to move back north. How many are we taking? He said. The Whitfields and the Delacroix couple for certain. The Reardon widow asked if she could come as far as the main road, and I said yes. He looked at her steadily. That's 14 people and a grandmother. Yes. In a 4-room cabin. It won't be forever, just through the worst of the immediate. He looked at her for another moment. You know you can't save everyone. I know that. She took Francis's reins. I'm not saving everyone. I'm saving who I can reach. She mounted. Jonah lifted Micah up to ride in front of her. The boy's preferred position now, not because Francis was his horse, but because Evelyn was who he chose to be near, which was a fact that had arrived without announcement and settled itself into the daily operation of their lives as simply and inevitably as everything else this child had decided. Micah arranged himself, arranged rabbit, looked north where the smoke was still rising, and then looked up at Evelyn. Home? He said. It was the clearest, most complete word she had heard him say. Not a 2-word combination or a sound approximating meaning. A plain, direct word with a question built into it. She looked at him. She looked at the smoke to the north, at the damaged land and the uncertain road and the 14 people getting organized behind her. Home, she said. Not a question. He nodded like that was the correct answer and turned back to face forward. Jonah had heard it. He was beside her on Amos, and she didn't look at him, but she could feel him absorbing it the way you feel weather change. Not dramatically, but in the quality of the air. They rode north. The road back showed them what the fire had taken in pieces. A fence line here, scorched to black wire on charcoal posts. A stand of pines that had burned from the inside out, and now stood still upright but hollow, the way things sometimes stood for a while after they were already gone. The crane operation was a skeleton of itself. The grain barn's stone foundation the only thing still legible. Someone had already been back. There were cart tracks in the ash, goods being salvaged. The Mercer property came into view around the bend at the south approach, which meant the cabin appeared first before the barn, and the cabin was standing exactly as Jonah had said. It stood in a yard that was edged in black on the north side, ash across the kitchen garden. The fence between the yard and the north pasture burned down, but the cabin stood. The porch was intact. The window glass was intact. The chimney stood. Evelyn stopped Francis at the yard gate. She looked at the cabin. She had hated it sometimes, in the worst of the last 2 years. The way it held the shape of her marriage without holding the man himself. The way rooms kept the dimensions of decisions that couldn't be undone. She had loved it too, in the specific way you love something that has sheltered you through more than you thought you could survive. It was still standing. After everything, the drought, the debt, the absence, the fire, it was still standing. Behind her she heard Micah say, quietly and with total certainty, home. She pressed her heels to Francis's sides and rode into the yard. Jonah came in behind her and dismounted and stood for a moment looking at the cabin with an expression she wasn't watching but was aware of anyway. The way you're aware of light changing direction without looking directly at the sun. He had not had a home in 12 years. He had had places to stay and situations to manage, and a son to keep alive, and that was not the same thing as a home, and she understood that without him saying it. She dismounted and handed Micah down to Jonah, who caught him with the ease of someone who had been catching this particular child for 2 years. Well, Jonah said. He looked at the burned edge of the yard, the downed north fence, the smoke still rising from the distant ridge. We've got some work to do. It was possibly the most understated thing he had ever said, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. We've always had work to do, she said. She went inside to start a fire. The stove was cold, but intact. The kitchen was as she'd left it. The table with the chairs pushed back, the lamp still where she'd set it, the tin pot under the pipe that she'd never gotten around to fixing properly, which she noted with a feeling that was somehow almost funny, that through fire and flood and 12 years of wrong history, the pipe still dripped and the tin pot still waited. She built the fire in the stove. It caught on the third match. Behind her she heard the wagon coming into the yard. The Whitfield children, Harriet Sargent, the Delacroix couple's cart. And she heard Jonah outside directing traffic with the same calm, flat efficiency he'd used all night, organizing parking and horses and where the animals should go while the barn was still half open to sky. She put the coffee on. It was the thing she could do right now. The damage assessment would come. The rebuilding would come. The winter and its requirements would come, and she and Jonah and every practical problem they faced would come. But right now the cabin was standing, and it was cold inside, and there were 14 people in the yard, and the coffee was the thing she could do. The first cup she poured, when it was ready, she took outside. Jonah was at the barn's east wall, looking at the damage with his hands on his hips, working something out. She came up beside him and held out the cup. He took it without turning, which meant he had heard her coming, which meant he had learned her footstep without trying to, the way you learn the sounds of a place that has become yours. He drank and looked at the wall. Repairable, he said, same word as before. How long? With help? Week. Maybe 10 days. He looked at the activity behind them, the families settling, the children running already, because children adapted faster than anyone, and were already treating the Mercer yard as simply the new place they were in. I think we're going to have help. They stood there while the morning moved around them, damage and survival existing in the same frame, the ash smell still thick but the smoke less so, the sky beginning to move towards something more like actual sky. I owe you more than the fence, Jonah said. You owe me exactly what we agreed, she said. Work. He turned and looked at her then. Really looked. The way he had the night before across the camp, the way he had on the first night in the doorway. Like a man who has run out of distance to keep. And what else? He said. Not quite a question. She held his gaze. She thought about 12 years. She thought about 6 letters in a tin box. She thought about Micah saying home in the voice of a child who meant it completely. That part, she said, we're working out as we go. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was the truest thing she knew how to say, that they were here, both of them, and the ground under them was scorched but solid, and they were not done. Jonah nodded. He finished the coffee and handed the cup back. I'll start on the wall today, he said. Good. She turned back toward the cabin. Breakfast first. And Micah, who had appeared at the porch steps at some point during all of this with Rabbit under one arm and Packet the dog at his heels, looked at the two of them moving toward the house and said, with the authority of a child who has made a comprehensive assessment and reached a conclusion, good. Packet wagged once, which was, for Packet, an enormous endorsement. The cabin door opened. The fire in the stove was going. 14 people in the yard were beginning to understand what the next days required of them. The ash was still settling across the north pasture, and the fence line was down, and the barn wall was open to November air. And the work ahead was the kind of work that didn't have a clear end, only a series of beginnings. All of it was true at once. The damage and the standing cabin and the coffee and the child at the door and the man who had come back and the woman who had let him in. All of it true at once. The first morning back was the hardest, not because of the damage, though the damage was extensive and visible and required immediate triage, but because of the specific quality of exhaustion that follows a night of sustained fear. It was a different kind of tired than the kind that came from hard work. Hard work tired your body and left your mind functional. A night of managing a fire evacuation with 14 people and too many animals, and not enough information, tired something deeper, some structural layer underneath the muscles, and what it left behind when it released was not rest, but a hollow, shaky version of wakefulness that made everything feel slightly unreal. Evelyn stood in her kitchen at first light and looked at the stove she had lit the night before and felt this hollowness, and decided the only available response to it was breakfast. She made enough for everyone. This was not as straightforward as it sounds. The kitchen was hers, built for 2 people and manageable for 3, and there were now, by her count, 14 adults and children distributed between the 4 rooms of the cabin, Harriet's bedroll in the front room, the Whitfield family in the back bedroom, the Delacroix couple in Thomas's old study, and the Reardon widow who had been supposed to stop at the main road, but whose horse had come up lame, and who was therefore still present and sleeping on the settee with a quilt over her head. Jonah and Micah had stayed in the barn, which was partly Jonah's choice, and partly practical necessity, and partly, Evelyn understood, his way of not pressing himself into a situation he wasn't sure of the dimensions of yet. She scrambled 12 eggs and made a pan of cornbread and put coffee on. And by the time the first child appeared in the kitchen doorway, Hannah Whitfield's oldest, a serious 7-year-old named Peter, who had the look of a boy who had already decided to be useful and was looking for assignment. There was something on the table to give him. "Can I help?" Peter asked. "You can carry that plate to the front room and come back," she said. He did? He came back? He carried 4 more things without being asked. Evelyn noted this and thought that if Hannah Whitfield had raised one steady child in the middle of all this, she had done something right. Jonah came in from the barn when he smelled the coffee, which she had somewhat expected. He came through the back door, which meant he'd already been up and looking at the barn wall in the early light. He had that focused inventory look she'd come to recognize, the expression of a man cataloging problems in the order he intended to address them. "Well," she said, "the east wall's the main issue. The roof over that section needs to come off before we rebuild the wall. It's not safe as is. Some of the interior structure is burned, but the main posts are solid." He poured himself coffee. "Amos is fine. Frances ate half a hay bale overnight, which means she was stressed, but she's fine." "And Micah?" "Still asleep." He said it with the particular tone of someone who considers the sleeping child a small daily miracle. "He went out like a candle. I think he walked about 9 miles yesterday in his estimation." "He did well," Evelyn said. "He never panicked." "He doesn't panic much." Jonah sat down at the table with his coffee. "I think he came into the world with a higher tolerance for chaos than most people ever develop, which is either very lucky or very sad, depending on how you look at it." "Both," she said. "Probably." "Yeah." He looked at his cup. "Both." The cabin filled up fast after that. Children required feeding first, which meant the adults stood around the edges of the kitchen while the children occupied the table, and Evelyn moved between stove and table with the efficiency of someone who had decided that the logistics of the moment were going to be handled with grace, even if the feelings underneath them were considerably messier. Hannah Whitfield stood beside her and helped without being asked and without getting in the way, which was the precise skill that separated useful help from the kind that created extra work. "I want to know what you need from us," Hannah said, when the children were settled and the 2 of them had moved to the far end of the counter. "Not generally, specifically, today." Evelyn looked at her. Hannah was 43, raw-boned and practical, the kind of woman who expressed care through competence. Her 4 children had been fed first. Her husband, Robert, was already outside. She'd seen him through the window talking to Jonah at the barn. "The north fence line is down. All of it, as far as I can see. The cattle are in the south pasture, and they need to stay there until we can assess the north pasture for safety. Robert can check the fence line. Jonah's going to start on the barn wall. He'll need another pair of hands. Robert can do both. He can assess the fence and then help with the barn." Hannah said it without hesitation, already organizing in her head. "The children need to be kept back from the north pasture. Peter seems reliable." "He is. He's been reliable since he was 5, which I feel somewhat guilty about." She said it dryly, and Evelyn recognized the particular guilt of a mother who has leaned on a child's steadiness in hard times. "I'll put him in charge of keeping the others in the yard. He'll take it seriously." "Good." Evelyn paused. "Your family is welcome here for as long as you need. I want to say that plainly." Hannah looked at her for a moment. There was something working behind her eyes, not the sentimentality of the overwhelmed, but the harder emotion of someone who has been managing dignity on a knife's edge. "We appreciate it," she said. "We'll get clear of your hair as soon as we have something to go back to." "There's no rush." "There is, though." Hannah turned to look at her children at the table. "Not because we're not grateful. Because I need them to understand that we rebuild. That we don't accept other people's houses as our permanent situation." She paused. "Do you understand what I mean?" "Completely," Evelyn said. "My mother said something similar once. Something about the difference between help and replacement." Hannah nodded. It was the nod of two women who had understood each other without requiring further language, which was its own kind of efficiency. The barn wall came down on the second day, not by accident, by decision. Jonah and Robert Whitfield spent the first day removing the compromised roof section above the burned wall, which was slow, careful work that involved a great deal of going up and coming down and reconsidering. By the end of that day, they had established that the fire damage to the wall itself was worse than first assessed. Two of the secondary posts had burned through at the base, which meant the wall wasn't just damaged, it was structurally dishonest. It was standing the way things stood sometimes after they were already gone, through inertia and luck rather than integrity. Jonah came in for supper on the second evening and told Evelyn this, standing at the kitchen door with his boots still on because he knew he'd be going back out. "Take it down," she said. "It's going to leave the barn open for a few days while we rebuild." "I know." "The horses can go in the paddock. It's cold, but not—" "Jonah," she said, "take it down. A wall that looks solid but isn't is worse than no wall." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she still didn't fully have a name for, the one that meant he was seeing her clearly and was moved by what he saw but was keeping that information mostly to himself. "All right," he said. "How much lumber do we need?" "More than we have on hand. There's timber in the shed, enough for maybe half of it. The rest we'd need to source." He paused. "I can ride to Millhaven tomorrow after we drop the wall. See what Tanner's Mill has available. Take the money from the strongbox. The amount on the top paper is what's available." He nodded. He turned to go. "Jonah." He stopped. "Be careful in Millhaven." She said it carefully, not wanting to overdress it. "People are going to be—" She looked for the right word, unsettled. After a fire like this, there's always people looking for somewhere to put their anger. He turned back. "You think they'd put it on me? You're new." People who've lost things sometimes find it easier to resent the new arrival than to sit with their loss. She held his gaze. "I'm not telling you to be afraid of it. I'm telling you to know it's possible." Something in his face went quiet, not with fear, but with a specific kind of recognition. He had been the new arrival before. He understood what she was describing. "I'll be careful," he said. He went out. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard in the late light, and she thought about the conversation with Hannah, about the difference between help and replacement, and she thought about how precisely that distinction applied to what was happening between herself and Jonah. Not replacement, not erasure of what Thomas had been and what that life had meant, but something existing alongside it, something occupying a different room. She was still working out what to do with that. Millhaven was, as predicted, unsettled. The fire had not touched the town itself. The river line had held, and the volunteer fire break that a dozen men had cut along the western ridge had apparently done some good. But the valley beyond the town was transformed, and the people who lived in the transformed valley had been coming into Millhaven for 2 days with ash on their clothes and flat-eyed accounting of what they'd lost. And the town had absorbed this and was now vibrating with the specific tension of a community that has processed shock and is approaching the more complicated territory of what comes next. Jonah felt it the moment he rode in. It was not directed at him. Particularly, he was not significant enough in the town's understanding of itself to be a specific target. But he was noticed. He was a newcomer in a place where the established community was hurting, and there was a certain quality of attention that followed him down the main street that was not hostile, but was watchful in a way that required navigation. I went to Tanner's Mill first. Tanner himself was behind the counter, a compact, square-built man with sawdust permanently in his eyebrows. And he looked at Jonah with the frank assessment of a merchant who had been dealing with fire-damaged property owners for 2 days and had developed a working system for it. "What do you need?" Tanner said. Jonah told him. Tanner wrote it down. He gave a number. Jonah looked at the number and looked at the money from Evelyn's strongbox and understood that these two things were not going to be fully compatible. He was about $4 short of the full order. I've got the 4, he said. I can cover it by end of week. The Mercer operation will stand behind it. Tanner looked at him. You're the man at the Mercer place. I am. Doing what exactly? Working the ranch, helping with the rebuild. Tanner was quiet for a moment, looking at the order. Evelyn Mercer's a good woman, he said. It was not quite approval and not quite a warning. It was a statement of fact being used as a kind of fence. Yes, Jonah said, she is. Another moment. Then Tanner made a mark on the order paper. End of week is fine. I'll hold the lumber. I was at the door when he heard his name from behind him. Not Tanner. Someone else. A voice he didn't know. Coming from the corner where 2 men were standing with their hats in their hands, and expressions he recognized as the particular combination of exhaustion and residual anger that followed disaster. You're Calloway, the man said. He was maybe 50, weathered, with the look of someone who worked livestock. From up past the Mercer fence line. That's right. The man looked at him steadily. Your barn wall. That was Ennis Reese's boy who came and warned you about the fire. Jonah didn't know this. He had not known who had passed the initial word. He had just smelled the smoke and seen Evelyn see it, and they had moved. I didn't know that, he said. I'm grateful to him. Ennis's family lost their whole north section. The man said it flat. 3 years of fencing, their cow barn. I'm sorry, Jonah said. And he said it the way you said things you meant, without the overlay of politeness that made genuine feelings sound like a performance. The man looked at him for another moment. Then he said, Ennis is going to need lumber too. When you talked to Tanner, it was not quite a request. It was not quite a demand. It was the specific social communication of a frontier community reminding a newcomer of how reciprocity worked out here. I'll talk to Tanner, Jonah said. He went back in and spoke to Tanner and adjusted the order, and rode back to the Mercer property with lumber enough for both barns to be delivered the following day. He was $5 short of what he had, which meant the money was going to require a conversation with Evelyn that he was not certain how to have. He came through the gate to find the yard substantially changed from how he'd left it. There were 4 horses at the rail he didn't recognize, and 2 wagons he'd never seen, and in the yard there were, he counted, at least a dozen people who had not been there when he rode out. Harriet was standing in the center of the yard with the expression of a woman who has been voluntarily managing a situation and is doing so competently, but would like acknowledgement of the scale. Robert Whitfield was talking to 3 men near the barn. The Whitfield children were running with 3 other children who appeared to have materialized from somewhere. He found Evelyn at the edge of the garden, talking to a woman he didn't know. What happened? He said, when the woman had moved off. Apparently word went around. Evelyn looked at the yard with an expression he couldn't fully read, some mixture of overwhelmed and something more complicated than overwhelmed, something that had gratitude in it, but also the specific discomfort of a private person being descended upon. Harriet told the Pembertons we were rebuilding the barn, and the Pembertons told the Garveys, and she gestured at the yard. They came to help. They came to help. She said it like she was still processing it. Dale Hargrove is here. Jonah looked around the yard. Dale Hargrove, who said a woman running a ranch alone was like a horse trying to shoe itself. Yes, that Dale Hargrove. She paused. He brought 3 of his hands and a full load of fence posts. A beat of silence. I didn't invite him, she said. I know. I also didn't turn him away, because the fence posts are what we need most, and I am not... She stopped. I am not so proud that I turn away fence posts when my fence is down and my cattle are contained only by the south pasture margin. What did Hargrove say when he arrived? She was quiet for a moment. He took his hat off. He said he was sorry about my north pasture. He said he hoped I'd let his men work for a day and not hold his previous words against him. She looked at her hands. He looked like it cost him to say it. So I said yes. Jonah found Dale Hargrove by his fence posts. A heavy-set man, maybe 60, with a face that had been weathered into a kind of permanent squint. Hargrove looked at him with the frank assessment that seemed to be the local conversational standard. Calloway? Hargrove said. Hargrove. A pause. Good fence work on the south line, Hargrove said, which was apparently his version of a full introduction. Thank you. Jonah looked at the fence posts. These are good posts. They are. Hargrove looked at the barn, the dropped wall, the work that was clearly ahead. You need more men on that wall. I know. I've got 3. They know what they're doing. I'd appreciate it. Hargrove nodded once. The conversation apparently concluded to his satisfaction and went to direct his men. Jonah watched him go and thought that people were complicated and the frontier made them more so, and sometimes the only thing you could do with that was accept it and use the fence posts. He found Evelyn again and told her about the lumber order, including the $5 and the Ennis-Reese family and the adjustment he'd made. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "You covered the difference with your own money. I'll put it toward what I owe you." "You don't owe me money, Jonah. We've had this conversation." "I know. I'm restating my position." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that she was trying to keep professional and neutral, and that was only partly succeeding. "The Reese family," she said. "They lost a lot. I know them. Ennis-Reese is a good man." She thought for a moment. "When the lumber comes, I'll send some of the extra posts over to their place." "I already accounted for that in the order." She looked at him. "You would have wanted to," he said, "so I did." She opened her mouth, closed it, turned to look at the yard full of people who had come without being asked to help rebuild something that wasn't theirs. She was quiet for long enough that he was uncertain whether he'd overstepped, whether acting on what she would have wanted was something she'd welcome or resent, whether— "Thank you," she said, very quietly, like it was something she didn't say easily and was choosing to say anyway. "Don't thank me for knowing you." She looked at him sideways. He didn't look away. "Stop doing that," she said. "Doing what?" "You know what." He almost smiled. "I'm not doing anything." "You're being—" She stopped, looked away. "You're making it very difficult to maintain appropriate distance." "That's not something I'm actively trying to do." "That's what makes it difficult." She walked away toward the barn, where Robert Whitfield was waiting for direction on the wall rebuild, and Jonah stood where she'd left him for a moment and felt something in his chest. Do something he didn't have an immediate name for, but that felt, cautiously, like the specific warmth of a thing that might actually be all right. Look, Micah discovered the windmill on the 4th day. Not in the sense that he didn't know it existed. He had been watching it since his first morning on the property, with the systematic attention he gave to all large mechanical things. But on the 4th day he discovered that if you stood at the base and looked up when it was turning, the blades made a pattern against the sky that was apparently the most interesting thing he had ever seen. Evelyn found him there at mid-morning, neck craned back, absolutely still. She stood beside him and looked up. The windmill was turning. Jonah had fixed the grinding issue in the 2nd week. The bearing had been dry, simple to address once you got up there. And now it turned smoothly, the blades cutting clean arcs against the November sky. "It's nice," she said. Micah continued looking up. Then, without taking his eyes off it, "Round and round." "Yes, round and round." "Wind does it?" "Yes. The wind pushes the blades and the blades pull the water up from the well." He considered this. "Water lives in the ground?" "Down deep, yes. The windmill helps us get it out." He thought about that with the seriousness he brought to all information. Then, smart. Very smart. Someone figured that out a long time ago. He finally looked down from the windmill and looked at her with that assessment that she had stopped finding unnerving several weeks ago and now simply accepted as the particular quality of this child's attention. "Evelyn," he said. "Yes?" "Do windmills get tired?" She looked at the windmill. "I don't think so. I think the wind does the work, and wind doesn't get tired." He processed this. Then he looked back up and appeared satisfied, as though this had resolved something important. He took her hand, just reached up and took it, the way he reached for things he wanted, without preamble or request, operating on the assumption that what he needed would be available. She stood there holding a 2-year-old's hand and looking at the windmill turning and felt the shift in her chest again. Not the cautious inch to the left of the first week, but something larger. Something that had been moving incrementally all this time and had now arrived somewhere. She loved this child. She did not know what to do with that exactly. She was not his mother. She had no formal claim to him and no formal standing in his life. He had a father who was present and attentive and had not given her any reason to believe that would change. And yet here was Micah Calloway at her feet holding her hand and looking at her windmill with the proprietary confidence of a child who had decided this place was his and she was part of it, and she could not locate inside herself any desire to correct that understanding. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back briefly, which was apparently acknowledgement enough, and then turned back to the windmill. She did not tell Jonah about this moment. She filed it in the same place she had filed the moment at the well casing, and the moment by the paddock fence, and the moment in the camp by the river when she'd held his hand and it had not been a decision. The place where things lived that she wasn't ready to articulate but wasn't willing to dismiss. On the 6th day, May Delacroix had her baby. It happened at 4 in the morning, and it was not the gentle arrival that some labors were. It was fast and loud and involved a great deal of activity in Thomas's old study and the participation of Harriet, who turned out to have delivered 17 babies over the course of her life on the frontier and treated the whole thing with the same competent authority she applied to everything else. Evelyn held May's hand through the hardest part. Henri Delacroix paced the front room in the way men paced when they were useless and knew it and couldn't stop. The baby was a boy, 7 pounds and furious about existing, with dark hair and enormous opinions about his current circumstances. He was fine. May was fine. Harriet sat back in her chair afterward with the expression of someone who has done something difficult and done it well and is now very ready for coffee. Peter Whitfield, who had apparently been awake the whole time because no noise in the cabin escaped that child's attention, appeared in the kitchen doorway at first light and said, "Is everyone all right?" "Everyone is all right," Evelyn said. "There's a new baby." Peter considered this. "Is that good?" "Very good." He appeared to accept this and went back to his bedroll with the practical adjustment of a child redistributing information. Jonah came in from the barn at sunrise and found Evelyn at the stove in the particular state of someone who has been awake all night and is operating on pure function. He looked at her and then at the closed study door and said, "Baby?" "Baby," she confirmed. He got 2 cups and poured the coffee himself. He put one in front of her and kept one. He didn't say anything else. He just sat down at the table in the morning light with his coffee and his quietness, and Evelyn sat across from him with hers, and the house was full of sleeping people and one new person, and neither of them needed to say anything about any of it. The barn wall was finished on the 8th day. It went up faster than it had come down, which was always the way of things built by multiple sets of hands with common purpose. The Hargrove men knew their business. Robert Whitfield was stronger than he looked and had a good eye for level. Jonah worked from first light until he couldn't see the work anymore, and what emerged at the end of the 8th day was a wall that was straighter and better fitted than the original had been, because the original had been built by one man in a hurry, and this one had been built by 6 men who were in no particular hurry and had the collective knowledge of 50 years of frontier construction between them. Dale Hargrove stood back and looked at the finished wall with the expression of a man who was satisfied with work, but was not going to be excessive about expressing it. "Good wall," he said. "Good men," Jonah said. Hargrove looked at him sideways. Then he looked at the Mercer cabin. "This is a good property, good bones." "It is. Evelyn Mercer runs it well." He paused. "Better than most would, circumstances being what they are." Jonah understood this was a different kind of fence communication than the one earlier in the week. "She does," he said. "She runs it better than most." Hargrove put his hat back on. "You staying on?" "That's not decided yet." "By who?" Jonah looked at him steadily. "By the people it's up to." Hargrove made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and brief. "Fair enough." He gathered his men, loaded up the remaining posts on his wagon, and rode out without ceremony, the same way he'd arrived. Evelyn came to stand beside Jonah and look at the finished wall. "He asked if you were staying," she said. She had been within earshot. "Yes." "What did you say?" "That it wasn't decided yet." He looked at the wall. "By the people it's up to." She was quiet for a moment. "You should know," she said carefully, like she was measuring each word for weight before she committed to it, "that Micah—" "I know about Micah," Jonah said quietly. "I haven't said anything to him. I haven't—" "Evelyn." He turned to look at her. "I know. I've been watching him follow you around this property for 2 months. I know what that is. I know what it means to him." He paused. "I also know what it means to watch the person you love most in the world choose someone as well. For him, that's a gift, not a complication." She looked at him. The word love had entered the sentence with the specific casualness of a man who had placed it there deliberately but was not going to make a production of it. The specific casualness of someone who meant it too plainly to dress it up. "He called me Mama," she said. It came out before she'd quite decided to say it. It had happened that morning. Micah had come in from the yard with something cupped in his hands, some small thing he'd found. and he'd come straight to her at the stove and held it up with the imperative of a child who has found treasure and requires a witness. And he had said mama as simply and completely as he had said home at the Ford crossing. Just the word, just her. She had stood very still. She had looked at the small thing cupped in his hands, a piece of quartz, smooth and white from the burned earth. And she had taken it from him and held it, and she had said, "That's beautiful, show Daddy," and sent him outside again. And she had stood at the stove afterward and not been able to move for a little while. Jonah was looking at her now with an expression she had no name for. It was not grief, and it was not joy, and it was not the complicated middle territory between those two things. It was something quieter and more final than any of those, the expression of a man arriving at a truth he has been approaching for a long time. "What did you say?" he asked. His voice was rough. "I told him to show you." She met his eyes. "I didn't say it wasn't right. I didn't correct him." She paused. "I didn't want to correct him." He looked at her for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said. "I know. I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not going to push you into something you're not. I know that too. But I need you to understand that when I say I'm not going to disappear, I know." "You keep saying you know. I need to say it anyway." She looked at him steadily. "Then say it. I'm not leaving. I'm not going to let something, some circumstance, some debt, some man managing a situation to his advantage. I am not going to let anything pull me away from you and Micah without a fight. Not again. I should have fought harder in 1877, and I didn't. And I have had 12 years to sit with what that cost both of us." His jaw was set. His voice was even. "I will not do it again." The wind came across the yard. The windmill turned. Inside the cabin, someone was moving. The particular footstep pattern she had already learned was Micah's, the specific rhythm of a 2-year-old navigating the world with great intention and slightly unpredictable direction. "I need time," she said. "I know. I'm not saying no to anything. I'm saying I need time to—" "Evelyn," he interrupted her gently but completely. "I just told you I'd wait. I've waited 12 years. A little more time is not an obstacle." She looked at him. Something in her chest that had been maintaining a careful, controlled posture for approximately 2 months did something involuntary. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that showed on her face, but something internal that was the equivalent of a door deciding to open. "You're different than you were," she said. "I know, so are you. I think I might like who you are now better." He looked at her with an expression that was something she had never quite seen on him before. Something fragile and certain at the same time. The expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for so long that being permitted to set it down feels almost frightening. "I think I might deserve that," he said. "A little bit, maybe." She almost laughed. It was a short, real sound, and it surprised her because she hadn't been expecting it, and she hadn't laughed, properly laughed, in longer than she could immediately calculate. Jonah's face changed when he heard it, the same way his face had changed when Micah laughed, with the quality of someone encountering something they had not known how much they needed. The cabin door opened and Micah appeared on the porch with his coat on wrong, and rabbit under his arm, and the piece of quartz she'd given back to him held out in front of him like a formal presentation. "For windmill," he announced. They both looked at him. "You want to give the quartz to the windmill?" Evelyn said. He nodded with great seriousness. She looked at Jonah. He looked at her. The situation was, she recognized, completely absurd, and also completely perfect, and also not available to be argued with. "All right," she said, "let's go give it to the windmill." She took Micah's free hand. Jonah fell into step on his other side. They walked across the yard in the November afternoon, the three of them, in the particular formation that had been assembling itself for 2 months, and that was now, without ceremony or announcement, simply how they walked. Micah placed the quartz at the base of the windmill post with the reverence of a child performing a ritual he had invented and fully believed in. The windmill turned above them, round and round. The wind did the work, and the wind, as established, did not get tired. Later that afternoon, when the Whitfield family was working on winter preparation in the south garden, and Harriet was reading in the front room and Micah was asleep for his nap, Evelyn went to the trunk at the foot of the bed and opened it. The blue quilt was there, the one Jonah had grabbed in the evacuation, the one she'd had since her mother. She lifted it and found, underneath, what she was looking for. The dress. The red dress. Her mother's dress. The one she'd thought was lost to the fire. It was not lost. It was here. It was also, she saw when she shook it out, burned at the hem. Just the bottom edge, singed through in a 6-inch section, the red fabric gone to black and brittle. It had caught something in the evacuation, or in the barn, or somewhere in the chaos of that night, and she hadn't known. She turned it over in her hands. The rest was intact. The bodice, the sleeves, the full middle of it, all as it had been, just the hem. She sat on the edge of the bed and held it and looked at the burned section and thought about what was still there. Not what was gone. What was still there. Most of it, she thought. Most of it is still here. She folded it carefully, the burned hem turned inward, and put it back in the trunk. She closed the lid. Then she went back to the kitchen, where there was work, and where Jonah was coming in from outside with mud on his boots and a question about the south fence, and where somewhere in the back room Micah was sleeping with Rabbit tucked under his chin, and where the pipe under the sink was still, steadily, quietly dripping into a tin pot that needed emptying. She got a fresh pot and swapped it out and emptied the full one in the yard, and when she came back in, Jonah was hanging up his coat and asking about the fence, and she told him what she knew about the south fence, and they stood in the kitchen and talked about practical things, posts and wire, and ground that was too cold to dig comfortably, and whether they could wait until spring. And none of it was romantic, and all of it was real, and that, she thought, was what home actually felt like. Not the grand moments. The pipe, and the pot, and the fence, and the question of whether the ground was too cold, answered together, in a kitchen that still smelled like the morning's coffee, and faintly of smoke that would not quite leave for a long time yet. That was it, but that was the thing. The pipe under the sink got fixed in December. It was not a dramatic event. Jonah noticed it dripping one morning, went to the shed for the right fitting, and repaired it in 40 minutes before breakfast. Evelyn came into the kitchen to find no tin pot on the floor and the space under the sink clean and dry for the first time in what she calculated was approximately 14 months. She stood and looked at it for a moment. "You fixed the pipe," she said. "It wasn't a hard fix, just needed the right fitting." Thomas kept meaning to. Jonah turned from the stove where he was managing the coffee. He looked at her, reading the weight of what she'd said. Not defensively, just attentively, the way he had learned to hear her in the months since October. "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to replace what Thomas did. I just fixed the pipe." "I know you did." She looked at the clean, empty space under the sink. "I'm not saying it as a complaint. I'm saying it as... I don't know what I'm saying it as." She paused. "It's just strange is all. When something you've been managing around for a long time is suddenly not there." "Good strange or bad strange?" She looked at him. "Just strange." He nodded and gave her the coffee and did not press it, which was the right thing to do. And she had noticed that he had been doing the right thing with some consistency for 2 months now, which was its own kind of information. December in Montana made October look gentle. The cold came in off the northern range with the blunt indifference of a season that had no interest in accommodation. And the ranch drew inward the way it always did. More time inside, shorter days, the particular cabin fever arithmetic of too many people in too small a space for too long together. The Whitfield family had moved back to their own land in late November, once Robert and his men had erected a temporary structure serviceable enough for winter. Hannah had come to say goodbye with the same directness she'd brought to the kitchen 6 weeks earlier. "We'll pay back the lumber costs in spring," Hannah said. She meant it as a statement, not a negotiation. "Spring wheat," Evelyn said. Same answer she'd given Aldous Fitch. It was becoming a standard currency. Hannah almost smiled. "You're a practical woman." "I've had to be." Hannah looked at the cabin, then at the yard, then at Jonah crossing from the barn with Micah on his shoulders. The boy's arms flung wide for balance and making no sound, but wearing an expression of pure velocity-related joy. Hannah watched this for a moment. "You've got good people around you now," she said. "Not a judgment, just an observation." "Getting there," Evelyn said. Hannah shook her hand, firm, single pump, the handshake of a woman who meant things. And that was the end of it. The Delacroix couple and the baby stayed through December. The baby, Henri had named him Louis, after some ancestor he described with great pride and in French that Evelyn caught only partially, turned out to be the kind of infant who slept in 4-hour blocks and was otherwise largely philosophical about his circumstances, which made him considerably easier than anticipated. May recovered steadily. By the 3rd week she was up and functional, and had developed a system for managing Louis that involved a great deal of organization and a sling that she wore from morning until evening. And Evelyn, who had never particularly thought of herself as someone with an opinion about infants, found herself watching May work with a quality of attention that was difficult to categorize. Micah had opinions about Louis. Primarily that Louis was small and couldn't do much and should be taught to talk, which Micah demonstrated by sitting near the baby and narrating things at him in the slow, deliberate way he'd seen Evelyn do with him. That's the ceiling. That's a window. Wind does the windmill. Round and round. Louis received all of this with the equanimity of an infant, and Micah took this as progress. Jonah watched his son teach a newborn about windmills and said nothing, but his expression said everything that needed saying. The question of what Jonah was, exactly, to the Mercer property, and to Evelyn specifically, had not been formally resolved. This was not an accident. It was a mutual, unspoken agreement to let the thing be what it was until it became clear what it needed to be, which was either wisdom or avoidance, depending on which day you asked, and how the weather was sitting. They worked together. They ate together. They managed the ranch's winter requirements with the efficiency of two people who had learned each other's rhythms, who knew without asking that Evelyn took the morning feeding and Jonah took the evening check, who had developed a system for the inventory and the accounts that divided naturally along the lines of what each of them was better at. Evelyn was better at numbers. Jonah was better at anticipating mechanical failure before it happened. These were not romantic discoveries. They were operational ones, which was part of why they worked. Micah moved freely between them and had stopped making any distinction that suggested he understood them to be separate units. The neighbors understood what was happening before either of the principals acknowledged it, because neighbors always did. Harriet said nothing directly, which was its own form of comment. Aldous Fitch, when he came by in December with a Christmas ham he claimed was incidental, and clearly was not, shook Jonah's hand with a warmth that communicated his position more thoroughly than words would have. The moment of formal resolution came on a Tuesday in January, which was not a dramatic day in any other respect. Evelyn was at the table with the account books, working through the winter figures, and Jonah came in from the cold with the news that Amos had a stone bruise on his left front that was going to need a week of rest, which was a logistical problem, but not a catastrophe. And he sat down across from her to talk through the week's work without the horse. And they were doing this, talking through practical things in the practical way they always talked through practical things. When he stopped mid-sentence, she looked up. He was looking at her with that expression, the one that was both fragile and certain. "I need to ask you something," he said. She put down her pen. "All right. Not about the ranch." "I know." I was quiet for a moment. Not from hesitation. She understood the quality of his silences now well enough to know this one was him finding the right words, not deciding whether to speak. "I told you in October that I wasn't going to push, that I'd give you time." He paused. "I have been attempting to honor that." "You have." "I need you to know that it's not detachment, Evelyn. It's not that I'm waiting to see if something better comes along or holding myself in reserve or Jonah." She said his name with enough steadiness to stop him. "I know what it is." Then you know I'd like an answer. When you're ready. If you—" He stopped again. Something crossed his face that was not quite nerves and was not quite certainty, but was somewhere in the specific territory between them. "If you want one." She looked at him across the table. She looked at the account books with their winter figures that were better than October had suggested they would be. She looked at the window where the snow was doing something soft and directionless in the January air. She thought about the tin box of letters. She thought about 12 years. She thought about the pipe under the sink and the windmill and the quartz at its base. She thought about Micah saying mama in the particular tone of a child who was not asking permission. "You said you wanted to earn the future," she said, "when you arrived. That was the word you used." "I remember." "Have you been doing that? On purpose? Earning it?" He held her gaze. "Every day." "I know," she said. "I've been watching." He waited. "One condition," she said. "Name it." "You never leave without talking to me first. Not for any reason. Not for shame, not for debt, not for someone managing a situation to their advantage. If something is wrong, you tell me and we face it together." She held his gaze. "That's the condition. The only one." "Agreed," he said. No hesitation, no qualifications. "Then yes," she said. "That's my answer." It was not a scene from a romance. Nobody moved across the room or took anyone in their arms. They were at a kitchen table with account books between them, and snow at the window, and a stone-bruised horse in the barn, and what happened was that Jonah reached across the table and took her hand the way he had that night by the river. Just placed it there, his hand over hers. And she turned her hand over so their palms were together, and they sat like that for a while with the fire in the stove ticking and the snow coming down outside. "I'll talk to the Reverend," he said eventually. "We'll talk to the Reverend," she said, "together." He almost smiled. "Don't," she said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're doing that thing with your face. I'm just sitting here." "Jonah." "Evelyn." She looked at him. He looked at her. She let herself smile, which was something she did only when she meant it, which made it mean considerably more than most people's smiles. They married in March, when the ground was starting to consider thawing, and the north pasture was showing the first uncertain green at its edges. Not the full grass of spring, just the suggestion of it, the ground's tentative agreement to participate again after winter. It was not a large wedding. The Millhaven Reverend in the small church, a handful of people who mattered. Harriet, who wore her best dress and spent the ceremony with an expression of compressed satisfaction. Aldous Fitch, who shook everyone's hand twice. The Delacroix family with baby Louis in the sling. The Whitfields, including Peter, who had been informed by Micah 3 weeks earlier that his father and Evelyn were getting married, and who had received this information with his characteristic 7-year-old gravity, and said that seemed like a good arrangement. Micah wore a suit that Evelyn had made from cloth she'd traded Harriet 2 jars of preserves for, and he wore it with the seriousness of someone performing an important function, which he understood himself to be. He stood between Jonah and Evelyn during the ceremony, which had not been planned but was not corrected, and he held Rabbit under one arm and Evelyn's hand with the other, and appeared to consider the whole proceeding satisfactory. After, there was food at the cabin. Nothing elaborate, just what people brought, which turned out to be substantial because frontier communities expressed feeling through contribution, and there were a lot of feelings in that room. Dale Hargrove came, which surprised Evelyn, and brought a side of beef that was frankly excessive and exactly right, and spent the afternoon talking cattle with Robert Whitfield in the corner and managing to look pleased with himself in a way that was almost endearing. Harriet found Evelyn alone in the kitchen for a moment in the middle of the afternoon, the two of them at the counter with the noise of the gathering in the front room. "Well," Harriet said. "Well," Evelyn agreed. "You look—" Harriet considered. "Tired," Evelyn laughed. "That's what you're going with. You look tired, and you look like someone who has made a decision and knows it's right and is still working out all the implications." Harriet looked at her with the direct affection of someone who did not perform softness but felt it deeply. Which is what right decisions usually feel like. Not relief. Just solid. "Yes," Evelyn said. "Solid." "Good." Harriet picked up a biscuit. "He's a decent man." "He is." "He's not Thomas." "No." "Good thing. You don't need Thomas again. You already lived that." Harriet looked at the door to the front room, where they could hear Jonah's voice, answering something, laughing at something, at ease in a way he hadn't been when he arrived in October. "You need what you've got." Evelyn looked at the door too. "I think I do." Harriet patted her arm once, firmly, and went back to the gathering. Spring came in full in April, and brought with it the particular chaos of a ranch that had been through fire and drought and winter, and was now attempting to reconstitute itself. The north pasture required reseeding. The rebuilt barn needed its roof properly finished. Jonah and Robert had done the emergency repair in November, but the spring rains showed them 2 places where the work had been adequate for cold weather and was not adequate for wet. 3 sections of the fence line needed digging and resetting where the posts had gone into frozen ground at wrong angles and heaved with the thaw. There was always something. Evelyn had learned this about ranching before she was 30, and it had not changed. The work was not a series of problems that got solved and then stayed solved. It was an ongoing negotiation with land and weather and animal and time, and the negotiation never concluded. It just moved to the next item. The difference was that she was negotiating with someone now. This was still an adjustment. She had been making decisions alone for 2 years. Longer, really, since Thomas had been sick before he died and the operational decisions had been hers in practice, if not in name. The habit of aloneness was deep, and it expressed itself sometimes in the specific friction of someone who started solving a problem before remembering that there was another person who might have a view on the solution. Jonah had a view on the south fence solution that was different from hers, and they argued about it on a Wednesday afternoon in April, with the kind of directness that came from two people who had agreed to be honest with each other and were now discovering what that meant when they disagreed. "The angle's wrong," he said. "The angle is the angle. The ground runs that direction. If we set them at that angle, we'll have the same problem in 3 years. We've had them at that angle for 20 years. And they heaved. She looked at the fence posts. She looked at the ground. She looked at him with the expression she made when she was weighing whether she was right or whether she was just familiar with her position. How would you set them? 2 degrees off from current, running the slope instead of fighting it. She thought about this. That would change the line. By about 4 feet over the full run. 4 feet matters on the north edge. Not as much as posts that heave every spring. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the ground. She looked at where the fence needed to go and where Jonah was suggesting it should go, and ran the 4 feet through her understanding of the property's boundaries and concluded that 4 feet was acceptable. "Fine," she said. He looked at her. "That was faster than I expected." "You were right. I'm not going to argue past the point where you're right." Evelyn Calloway admitting someone was right, he said. "I should mark the calendar." "Don't push it." I was grinning. She was trying not to. This was also part of the adjustment, the specific comedy that emerged from two people who took things seriously, learning to not take everything quite so seriously all the time. She had not known she was funny until Jonah laughed at something she said in November, genuinely and with surprise, and she had filed that away as information about both of them. Micah, who had been sitting on a fence post nearby observing the negotiation, offered 4 feet. They both looked at him. 4 feet is fine, he clarified, with the authority of a 2-year-old who has absorbed sufficient frontier ranch management to have opinions. "Thank you," Jonah said gravely. Micah hopped off the post and went to find Packett, whose company he preferred to most humans and who received this preference with continuing weary dignity said. The summer was dry again, but not as dry as the one before, which in Montana was the specific mercy of a region that did not promise abundance but occasionally delivered adequacy. The well held at its new depth. The north pasture came in with enough grass to start moving cattle back in July. The barn roof was properly finished in June and held through the summer rains without incident. Evelyn planted her kitchen garden and it produced unevenly, the way gardens did. Too many cucumbers, not enough carrots, the tomatoes coming in late, but with a quality that made up for the timing. She put up preserves in August and lined them on the shelf in the cellar, and found that the act of doing so, the same thing she had done every August for 20 years, felt different this year without being describable as different. Just the weight of it was different. The same jars on the same shelf in a life that was the same life and also not. Jonah found her there one afternoon, standing in the cellar looking at the jars. "You all right?" he said from the top of the stairs. "Yes." She turned. "Just looking." "At the preserves." "At the preserves." He came down the stairs and stood beside her and looked at the jars. "You've got more cucumber than you need." "I know. I always plant too many cucumbers. Thomas used to say the same thing." She paused. "I do it every year, and every year there are too many cucumbers, and I cannot seem to stop. I'll eat the cucumbers." "You don't like cucumbers." "I like them fine. You left them on your plate twice last week." "I was tired those nights." She looked at him. He looked at the jars with the expression of a man committed to his position. She shook her head and went back upstairs. This was also life. The cucumbers and the honest accounting of who ate them, and the small, ordinary friction of two people inhabiting the same space with their particular histories and preferences, and the ways those things did and didn't align. It was not beautiful in the way that stories made things beautiful. It was better than that. It was actual, which was its own kind of sustaining. Micah turned 3 in September. They made him a cake. Evelyn made the cake, which involved a negotiation with the stove temperature that she lost, resulting in a cake that was somewhat darker on one edge than intended but structurally sound, and, Micah determined after careful assessment, delicious. He ate 2 pieces and gave a piece to Packett and arranged the remaining piece on the table in front of Rabbit and declared the party a success. He had started talking in full sentences sometime in June, the words arriving in a rush after months of the 2-word combinations, as though language had been waiting for a moment of sufficient confidence and then simply arrived all at once. He talked the way he had always communicated, directly, with focus, with the particular economy of a child who said what he meant and did not ornament it. He said mama to Evelyn without variation or correction, and he said papa to Jonah, and he used both with the easy authority of a child for whom these were simply the correct words for the people they described. There had been no conversation about this. It had simply become true, the way things became true in the Calloway household, not through declaration, but through daily practice, through the accumulation of ordinary mornings and working days and evenings by the fire until the practice was indistinguishable from fact. On the evening of his birthday, after the cake, and after Packett had been informed of the significance of the occasion, and after Micah had been put to bed still holding Rabbit and the piece of quartz he kept on the windowsill of the room that was now his room, Evelyn and Jonah sat on the porch in the September dark. The stars were out. Montana in September had the kind of sky that reminded you the world was large, and the porch of the Mercer, the Calloway, property faced north, which meant you could see the ridgeline against the stars, the ridge that had burned in November and was now, 8 months later, showing the first new growth at its lower edges. Not trees yet, not for years, but green, working its way back up from the bottom the way things worked their way back. "He's 3, Jonah said. "I is. I keep thinking I should—" He stopped. "I should feel like I have a better understanding of what I'm doing than I do. 3 years in, I still feel like I'm figuring it out." "You think that goes away?" He looked at her. "I've been managing this ranch for 20 years, she said. "I still walk the fence line some mornings and find something I don't immediately know how to solve. You don't get past not knowing, you just get better at working through it." I was quiet for a moment. "That's either reassuring or terrifying." "Both," she said. "Probably." He looked at the sky. She looked at the ridge. They sat in the comfortable silence of people who had learned that silence between them was not absence but presence. Not the quiet of two people with nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who had said enough that the spaces in between also meant something. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "When I rode up to this property in October, when I knocked on that door." He looked at the porch boards. I was not in a good way, Evelyn. Not the worst I'd been, but close to it. Micah was sick, the towns were closed to us. I had been carrying 12 years of believing that you'd chosen to let me go, and I was—" He stopped. "I was running out of the particular kind of hope that keeps a person functional. Not dramatic, just running low." She listened. "I knocked on your door because I had nowhere else," he said. "I told you that. I was honest about it. But what I didn't tell you was that I also knocked because—" He paused. "Because even after everything, even after 12 years and a different life and everything that happened, when I was at the end of what I had, you were still the person I thought of." He looked at her. "I don't know what that means exactly. I don't have a clean way to say it. I just think you should know it." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a woman who had waited and then stopped waiting. She thought about the specific stubbornness of love that persisted after the reasons for it were gone, or seemed to be gone, and what that stubbornness meant, whether it was wisdom or foolishness, or just the particular nature of certain connections that didn't obey reasonable instruction. "I'm glad you knocked," she said. It was the simplest and most complete thing she knew how to say. He looked at her with that expression, the one that was fragile and certain, the one she had learned was not weakness but its opposite, the courage of a man who had been hurt enough to know what it cost and was choosing it anyway. "Me too," he said. The red dress lived in the trunk. Evelyn had not mended the burned hem. She had thought about it, had even set out the needle and the red thread once in December, and then had put them away again. She wasn't sure exactly why mending it felt wrong. Something about the burn being part of the story now. Not a flaw to be corrected, but a record of something survived. The dress was still mostly the dress. The burn was true. Both things were true at once. She showed it to Micah when he was old enough to ask about the trunk, which was when he was 4 and had developed a comprehensive interest in every object in the house and its history. She took it out and showed him the red fabric and the burned edge, and told him it had been his grandmother's, and then his mama's. His first mama, Clara, had never known this dress, so in that sense it was Evelyn's to give. And someday it would be part of whatever his story became. He looked at the burned hem seriously. He touched it with one finger. "Fire did that?" he said. "Yes, the big fire. The one the year before you turned 3, when we went to the river. Yes. He looked at it for another moment, but it didn't burn all the way. No, she said. It didn't. He thought about this. Because it's strong? She looked at him. 4 years old, with his father's careful eyes and some quality that was entirely his own, a quality she had no name for except that it was the quality of someone who would look at a burned thing and ask not what was lost, but what held. Yes, she said, because it's strong. He nodded, satisfied, and went back to whatever he'd been doing. She folded the dress and put it back. She did not mend the hem. She closed the trunk. Some years later, enough years that Micah's voice had dropped and his shoulders had broadened, and he had developed opinions about cattle management that were sometimes right and sometimes wrong, and always delivered with a certainty that was familiar from 2 different directions. He asked his father about the year they arrived. They were working the south fence together, the 2 of them, the same fence that Jonah had fixed in his first week at the property, now on its 3rd iteration of posts, because that was what fences needed in Montana. Evelyn was in the cabin. The day was the particular blue and gold of a Montana fall that looked generous and was not to be trusted. What made you knock on her door? Micah asked. Of all the places. Jonah was tamping a post. He did not stop working. She was the only person I was sure of, he said. Even after all that time? Some things you're just sure of. Micah thought about this in the way he thought about things, with the focused quiet that had never left him, even now, even grown. She didn't have to let you in. No, she didn't. Why do you think she did? Jonah tamped the post level, stepped back to look at it, looked at his son. Because she's Evelyn, he said. That's the only explanation I've ever had. Because she looks at a situation and finds the practical path forward, and sometimes the practical path and the right path are the same thing, and she's smart enough to see it. Micah was quiet for a moment. She told me once that the dress didn't burn all the way because it was strong. Jonah looked at him. The red dress. From the trunk. Micah met his father's eyes. I think she meant something else. Yeah, Jonah said. I think so too. They went back to the fence. The post was solid. The day was cold and getting colder, and there was more fence to finish, and winter was not going to wait for anyone's convenience, which was the first and last and constant truth of the place they lived in. Evelyn came to the cabin door and called them in for supper. Micah went. Jonah stayed for one more moment, looking at the north ridge, at the trees that had come back, slowly, over the years, working their way up from the base of the burn. They were not the same trees, they would not be the same forest for a generation at least. But they were trees, and they were there, and the ridge that had burned and the valley that had nearly gone with it had decided, without anyone's permission, to continue. He went inside. The door closed. The fire in the stove was going. The supper was on the table, and Micah was already eating, and Evelyn was saying something to him about his appetite. The same thing she had been saying for years, and Micah was responding the same way he always responded, which was without apology, and the lamp was lit, and outside the sky was going dark over a ridge full of new trees. This was not a perfect life. It had never been, and it was not going to become one. The fence would heave again in spring. The cattle would find new ways to be difficult. The accounts would be tight some years and adequate in others, and there would never be a year that felt completely safe, completely resolved, completely past the possibility of loss. But the door was closed and the fire was going, and the people inside it had chosen each other with full knowledge of the cost, and that, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of that choosing, was what made the walls of the place stand. That was what home had always been. Not the timber, never just the timber. The people who looked at every reason to walk away and stayed anyway.